Welcome back to Historical Sleep, the storyteller for your sleep partner that digs up the history beneath our feet. If you love stories about small towns with big secrets, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode and can follow Alara's journey in real time. Drop us a comment below or reply to this episode on our story and let us know where you are right now. Seeing our audience map grow is one of the best parts of making this show. Your input keeps these stories alive. The year was 1773. The air of Boston carried the sharp, familiar tang of salt and pine smoke, a scent that was fundamentally American, a blend of wild nature and tenacious industry. Yet, on this crisp autumn morning, a newer, colder scent overlay it all. The stale wool and polished brass of a foreign military occupation. Josiah Reed, just 20 years old and burdened with the perpetual smudge of ink that marked him as an apprentice to the printed word, felt that coldness deep in his bones. He leaned against the rough wooden frame of his window in the cramped garret above the printing shop, watching the sun burn off the harbor fog. Below him, the cobblestones of King Street glistened, not just from morning dew, but from the recent passage of a patrol of His Majesty's 29th Regiment of Foot, redcoats, arrogant and uninvited. This colony, Massachusetts, was the richest and most troubled jewel in the Crown's North American treasury. It was a place built by fierce, independent minds who had fled one form of distant tyranny only to find another setting root across the vast Atlantic. Boston was the heart of the rebellion, even if the heart was still beating quietly, carefully, beneath the stiff linen shirt. It was the fallow ground, rich, fertile, and only waiting for the first furrow to be turned by the plow of revolution. "Josiah, the press awaits no man, least of all a dreamer." The voice, a gravelly pronouncement that needed no second invitation, belonged to Mr. Elias Thorne, master printer, patriot sympathizer, and Josiah's practical, if short-tempered, guardian. Josiah sighed, wiped his hands on his canvas apron, and moved toward the narrow staircase. The print shop smelled of oil and lead and aged paper, a smell of knowledge, both authorized and forbidden. Elias Thorne and Son, though the son had died of consumption 5 years prior, was officially responsible for printing ledgers, legal notices, and copies of royal decrees. Unofficially, after midnight, the shop became the clandestine press for the Sons of Liberty. "The broadsides for the Customs House, Master Elias?" Josiah asked, already pulling the heavy paper stack closer to the main press. Elias, a man whose glasses perpetually slipped down his nose, squinted at Josiah. "Aye, the usual garbage. His Majesty's right to levy duties. It's a good thing ink doesn't blush, or these papers would run red before the press even touched them." He paused, leaning heavily on the wooden frame of the composing stick. "But first, the real work. The latest draft of the committee's missive, the one about the tea." The word tea hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. It wasn't the drink itself, it was the principle. The British Parliament had passed the Tea Act 7 months prior, granting the East India Company a monopoly and allowing them to undercut colonial merchants while still enforcing the tax. It was a calculated insult, a way of tricking the colonies into accepting the hated tax under the guise of a cheap beverage. Josiah nodded, moving to the imposing dark wooden typecase. His fingers, deft from years of practice, danced over the hundreds of compartments, picking out T-R-E-A-S-O-N, one lead letter at a time. The real language of the colonies was being spoken not in the halls of Parliament, but here, in the cold, methodical arrangement of metal type. The tension wasn't always a scream. Most often, it was a constant, low-grade abrasion. It was the cost of empire being borne on the shoulders of ordinary Americans. Later that afternoon, Josiah was dispatched to the North End Market to secure a replacement for a broken brass matrix, an essential piece of printing equipment. The route was short, but unavoidable. It took him past the barracks and down a street frequently patrolled. The Quartering Act, the first of the so-called intolerable acts, had forced Bostonians to house and supply the troops. Though the immediate act had expired, the presence of the troops remained, a visual insult to the colonial right to privacy and self-government. It was not uncommon to see redcoats lounging on private stoops or demanding service in taverns with an air of entitlement that chafed even the most loyalist heart.
Hastings grinned, revealing a gap between his front teeth. Legal, eh? And what is legal in this colony is what the king decrees, boy. Not what your loud-mouthed farmers and merchants decide over their wretched cider. He reached out a heavy gloved hand and knocked the bag from Josiah's grasp. The brass matrix, a dense, valuable piece, hit the cobblestones with a dull thud. Josiah felt the familiar surge of heat in his cheeks, a mixture of humiliation and outrage. That single brass piece was worth a day's wages. Please, sir, that is not yours to touch. Oh, is it not? Hastings took a step closer. The closeness, the smell of cheap gin and unwashed wool was oppressive. Everything here belongs to the crown, boy, even the breath you draw. He planted his foot squarely on the matrix. Pick it up, and be thankful I don't report your insolence to the commander. Josiah had no choice. Kneeling slowly, he reached under the soldier's polished boot. The act felt like a physical submission, a metaphorical crushing of his rights. He retrieved the piece, his hands trembling. Thank you, Corporal. Good day. He didn't wait for a reply, turning and walking away quickly. The soldier's laughter followed him, sharp and ugly, but the small victory, avoiding arrest and retrieving the matrix, was cold comfort. The incident was minor, a daily occurrence for many Bostonians, but each tiny friction scraped away at the loyalty once felt for the distant crown. It wasn't Parliament's abstract law that turned hearts. It was the heady boot on the street. The economic plight of the colonies was the most effective recruiting tool for the resistance. Taxes were not paid in grand pronouncements. They were paid in shillings, scraped together from dwindling profits. Josiah found the brass matrix he needed, but his mind remained fixed on the debt. On his way back, he detoured to the docks, the epicenter of Boston's commerce, and currently its frustration. The harbor was busy, but falsely so. The ships tied up were mostly smaller coastal traders. The great towering masts of the British East India Company ships were expected soon, 4 of them, laden with 2,000 chests of tea. That tea, now subsidized and artificially cheapened by the crown to force entry into the market, represented ruin for every independent colonial merchant who had relied on Dutch imports or smuggling for their trade. Josiah spotted Samuel Adams, not the great orator the history books would later describe, but a restless, middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a perpetually worried frown, speaking quietly to a group of ship captains and dock workers near a pile of hemp rope. He didn't approach Adams, but he recognized a face nearby, Silas, a hulking dock worker with hands like stone who occasionally came to the print shop for repair work. Silas, Josiah greeted him, touching the brim of his cap. Silas turned, his face grim. Josiah, what's your business here, lad? Not sniffing for trouble, I hope. Just returning from the hardware exchange, but I see the harbor is ready to burst. Silas spat into the water, a harsh sound. It's ready to drown, not burst. They're coming, the tea ships, and when they land, every honest merchant here loses his livelihood. They want us to swallow the tax and choke on the monopoly. It's an affront to God and commerce. Mr. Elias says it's taxation without representation. Representation, aye, that's the law, Silas grumbled, adjusting a coil of rope. But look at it, Josiah. We are 3,000 miles away.
We can send a petition and it takes 3 months to cross the ocean. 3 months for Parliament to ignore it, and another 3 months for us to hear that we've been ignored. That's half a year. They govern us from a distance where they cannot smell the smoke of our fires, taste the salt of our sweat, or hear the complaints of our women. We are not citizens to them. We are just a distant account ledger. Silas's words crystallized the heart of the matter. It wasn't the amount of the tax that truly stung. It was the autonomy that was being denied. The colonies viewed themselves as mature, capable entities, ready to manage their own local affairs, especially trade. The king and parliament, however, insisted on treating them like children whose allowance they controlled. This paternalistic arrogance was what turned abstract political principle into visceral, personal rage. "What will happen when the ships arrive, Silas?" Josiah asked, his voice low. Silas looked around carefully, his eyes lingering on a nearby red-cot sentry who was trying, poorly, to flirt with a market girl. "Nothing good, Josiah. Nothing good at all. We have made it clear time and again the tea must not be landed. If it is landed, the duty must be paid. If the duty is paid, the principle is lost. And if the principle is lost, we are slaves." He dropped his voice further, his massive hand resting on Josiah's shoulder. "When the tea comes, son, stay inside. The men are not interested in polite protest this time." The warning was clear. The fallow ground was about to be broken. The print shop was quiet that evening, illuminated by the guttering flame of a single whale oil lamp hanging above the composing stone. Elias Torn was setting the type for the final incendiary missive. Josiah was working the press, printing the legitimate and dull custom house sheets. It was the perfect cover. Elias was a man of letters, not of action, but his words were the match that lit the kindling. He was quoting John Locke and invoking the spirit of Cato, ideas that had shaped the Enlightenment and now felt dangerously radical when applied to their current situation.
"Whensoever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people," Elias read aloud, his voice low and fervent, translating the Latin in his mind as he spoke. Josiah paused the press, the rhythmic thud of the lever stopping the comforting sound of industry. "That's strong language, Master Elias. Is that not seditious?" Elias placed the composing stick down gently, adjusting his glasses. "Sedition is defined by the tyrant, Josiah. If they call our demand for inherent rights seditious, then we are all seditious. And if we are all seditious, then who are they to punish us?" He gestured around the dim shop. "Look at this, son. The types we use, Baskerville, Caslon, they are symbols of civilization and reason. Yet the work we do is becoming the work of war. They want us to be content, to accept the cheap tea and forget the yoke. But we are Americans. We didn't cross an ocean to be told how to live by men who have never smelled the Atlantic or fought off a bear. Our property, our governance, our lives, they are self-evident gifts, not privileges to be granted by a king." Josiah approached the composing stone. The metal letters were cold, sharp, and weighty, each one a potential weapon. He saw the phrase Elias had just set. It was clean, stark, and utterly undeniable to the colonial mind. "It is not enough to print it, Master Elias," Josiah said, his voice barely a whisper. "The ships are coming. We talk in dark rooms, and the troops walk the streets in broad daylight. The fallow ground is fertile, but nothing can grow if the king's men constantly tread upon the seeds." Elias smiled sadly, running a hand over the freshly inked form. "Seeds, Josiah, are stubborn things. They need darkness and pressure to break the hull. The pressure is coming, and it will be immense. and when it breaks, the seed will find the light. A distant bell rang the 9 o'clock hour. The work was done. Elias took the finished broadside, carefully rolling it up and tucking it into his cloak. The committee meets tonight. I must deliver this before morning. You, my boy, must ensure the Customs House papers are stacked and ready by dawn. We must appear to be busy, loyal subjects. The most dangerous rebel is the one who hides in plain sight. As Elias left, disappearing into the cold, occupied streets, Josiah stood alone in the quiet shop. The silence after the heavy clang of the press was deafening. He looked at the window, seeing the faint glow of the distant lanterns carried by the British patrol. The world he knew was balanced on a razor's edge. He thought of Corporal Hastings' boot on his valuable brass matrix. He thought of Silas's face, etched with worry over ruin. He thought of Elias's dangerous, beautiful words. The seeds were not just planted in the ground, Josiah realized. They were planted in him. And the moment the tea ship sailed into that harbor, the harvest would begin. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of lead and freedom filling his lungs, and waited for the morning. The quiet before the storm was almost over.
The clock in the Old North Square church tower had struck 10. The November cold had deepened, and the earlier mist had been replaced by a thin, biting fog that seemed to swallow the light from every single lamp. Josiah Reed, clutching the roll of parchment, Elias Thorne's explosive broadside, felt less like a messenger and more like a walking piece of contraband. He moved through the narrow back alleys of Boston, avoiding King Street, where the redcoat patrols were heaviest. The mission was simple: deliver the paper to the Green Dragon Tavern, the unofficial war room of the Sons of Liberty. But simplicity rarely meant safety in an occupied city. Every shadow felt like a hiding place, and every distant drumbeat seemed to mark his own anxious pulse. Josiah was a man of the press. His domain was logic, ink, and the orderly arrangement of type. Yet tonight, he was plunging headfirst into the messy, dangerous realm of conspiracy. He was relying on the whispered network of patriots that held Boston together, a clandestine system of recognition, signals, and shared sacrifice. He reached the mouth of the alley leading to Union Street. The noise of a nearby tavern, the salutation, spilled out, loud, drunken, and purely loyalist. Josiah pressed himself against the cold brick, waiting for a detachment of the 64th Regiment to pass him. They marched past him, their steps heavy and precise, their scarlet coats a brazen declaration of power in the darkness. Do not give them reason. Elias's constant warning was the only thing keeping Josiah's feet moving. The tension of holding the broadside, the literal words of rebellion, was almost unbearable. Finally, he reached the Green Dragon. Unlike the loud, boisterous salutation, the Green Dragon was a masterclass in calculated deception. From the street, it looked like any other establishment. A sign depicting the legendary coiled beast hung slightly askew, and the lower windows showed only a few men drinking ale and playing draughts. It looked safe, dull, and entirely benign. Josiah gave the agreed-upon knock, a quick 3, a pause, and 2 deliberate taps at the side door. The door was opened not by a brawny tavern hand, but by a young woman with a wickedly intelligent gaze and hands stained with flour. This was Abigail Thorne, Elias's niece and the tavern's true manager. She was 22, but possessed the weary authority of someone who had seen too much of the world's politics in her own pub. "Evening, Josiah," Abigail greeted him, her voice low and crisp. Her eyes, however, darted quickly to the street behind him. "Abigail, Master Elias sends his latest sermon." Josiah handed her the roll of paper. She took it, tucking it immediately into the voluminous pocket of her apron.
The committee is in the back room. They sound like a nest of angry hornets tonight. Go on through. The back room of the Green Dragon was no larger than Josiah's print shop, but the men gathered there filled it with monumental importance. They were the engine of the resistance. Merchants, artisans, lawyers, and dock workers, all united by the common thread of resentment and radical thought. The room smelled of tobacco, spilled brandy, and burning ambition. Josiah slipped in, finding a quiet place against the back wall, observing the constellation of colonial power. Seated at the head of the long, battered pine table was the movement's most tireless agitator, Samuel Adams. Not a man of commanding physical presence, Adams was thin and earnest, his clothes slightly threadbare, his wig perpetually askew. But when he spoke, the room listened. He was the master communicator, the man who could turn an economic grievance into a moral crusade. Next to him sat Dr. Joseph Warren, a physician whose elegant attire and professional reputation belied his dangerous dedication. Warren was the movement's intellectual muscle, a man who could argue Blackstone one moment and tend to a wounded dock worker the next. But Josiah's attention was drawn to a new impressive figure, a man in fine imported wool and a perfectly tailored waistcoat whose silver-buckled shoes were a stark contrast to the rough boots of the other men. This was Arthur Vance, one of Boston's most prominent and recently disillusioned merchants. Arthur Vance represented the shifting loyalties of Boston's economic elite. For years he had been a staunch loyalist, viewing the Sons of Liberty as dangerous rabble. But the Tea Act, a direct assault on his own wealth and monopoly, had been the final unforgivable insult. Vance didn't care about taxation without representation. He cared about economic tyranny. Yet his vast network and wealth made him a powerful convert. Vance was speaking, his voice smooth and educated but edged with genuine fury. They intend to ruin us. Ruin! The East India Company will flood this port with 18 million pounds of tea, tax-free to them, duty required for us. My warehouses stocked with legal Dutch imports become worthless overnight. This is not governance, gentlemen. This is the looting of the colonies by the Crown. Elias Thorne, arriving late, placed the rolled broadside on the table, silencing the room. Arthur speaks truth, but the looting is not just of shillings, it is of spirit. That is why I have prepared this missive. Elias unrolled the paper, the lamplight catching the bold type. No power on earth has a right to lay taxes on us without our consent. Adams leaned forward, his eyes alight. Excellent, Elias. We must print 2,000 of these and paste them across the town square by dawn. We must make it impossible for Governor Hutchinson to ignore the voice of the people. The meeting quickly devolved into a passionate debate, revealing the earliest fissures in the radical movement, the divide between protest and action. Silas, the dock worker Josiah had met, spoke next, his voice booming with the frustration of the labor class. Broadsides are fine, Mr. Adams, but they are paper. The Dartmouth, the first tea ship, is already due within days. When she drops anchor, what then? Do we argue Latin with the captain? Do we wave paper at the cannons? We need more than words. We need assurance that the tea cannot be landed. Direct action is treason, Silas, Arthur Vance countered, leaning back slightly, still favoring a legalistic approach. If we physically prevent the ship from docking, they will send a warship. The Crown has used the presence of troops to enforce policy since the massacre. We must use every legal and diplomatic maneuver possible. The consignees must refuse the cargo. The governor must send the ships back. Dr. Warren tapped the table for order. Arthur is right that we must exhaust all civil remedies, but we must also plan for their failure. Gentlemen, the question is this. When Governor Hutchinson refuses to yield and the Customs House demands the duty be paid, Will we allow the cargo to clear the port?
A chorus of "No!" swept the room. Adams stood, his stature seeming to grow with the gravity of the decision. The tax must not be paid. The tea must not be landed. If we pay this duty, we set a precedent that will permanently enslave our commerce and our freedom. We will gather the whole populace. We will keep watch on Griffin's Wharf. We will form a human wall if necessary, but the tea will not leave those ships. Josiah watched, mesmerized. This was not a crowd of angry men. This was the birth of a governing body, usurping the power of the crown through sheer moral and popular will. The atmosphere was electric, tense, and utterly revolutionary. This room was where radical thought solidified into radical plan. The meeting paused for a brief moment of refreshment, and Josiah took the opportunity to speak with Abigail. She was moving with fluid efficiency, clearing tankards and refilling the pitchers of lukewarm cider. "A war of words tonight," Josiah remarked quietly, helping her stack the pewter mugs. Abigail gave him a dry look. "Words turn to powder quickly here, Josiah. They talk of petitions, but they are planning riot. Did you see Mr. Vance? The rich suddenly care about the rights of the common man when the king threatens their gold." "Do you trust him?" Josiah asked, nodding toward Vance, who was now engaged in an intense conversation with Adams. "I trust his self-interest, which for now aligns with ours. That's the beauty of this revolt, Josiah. It's held together by everyone's personal slight against the crown, be it a farmer's tax, a lawyer's pride, or a merchant's profit. But they all call it liberty." Abigail represented a crucial element of the resistance often overlooked, the non-male network of support. As a tavern keeper, she heard everything. As a woman, she was invisible to the military surveillance. She was the hub for whispered communications, the person who knew who to trust and who was ripe for recruitment. "Elias told me you are the key to the news network," Josiah said. Abigail smiled, a flash of genuine warmth in her weary eyes. "The roads are watched, Josiah. A man on a horse carrying a sealed letter is a target, but a woman carrying eggs to Dorchester or a child taking medicine to Roxbury, they are invisible. I relay messages from the committee, coded language about shipments of sugar or weather patterns, to 20 different points outside of Boston. The revolution, dear Josiah, is sewn together with thread and gossip, not just gunpowder." Her observation confirmed what Josiah felt. The revolution was not just being fought by the famous names at the table, but by the ordinary people willing to risk everything in their daily lives. As the meeting reconvened, Adams called Josiah forward. "Josiah Reed," Adams began, resting a hand on Elias's shoulder. "Your master Thorne speaks highly of your discretion and speed. The committee has decided that our voice cannot remain trapped in Boston. We must rouse the countryside. The surrounding towns must be ready to refuse the landing and support Boston's defense of the principle." Josiah swallowed, the fear tightening his chest. This was far beyond printing a broadside. This was travel, risk, and potentially arrest as a spy. "What is the mission, sir?" "You will carry a series of resolutions," Dr. Warren explained, presenting a small, tightly wrapped scroll. "These are not signed. They are not explicitly treasonous. They merely request the town selectmen meet immediately to affirm the non-importation of dutiable tea." Vance added, "The wording is legal, but the intent is fire. You will travel south, toward Plymouth and Taunton. You will deliver these to trusted contacts. If stopped by a king's officer, you are a printer's apprentice delivering a debt notice to a distant client. You understand?" "I understand the debt, sir." "Good, but the true urgency lies in the accompanying message. It is verbal. The code is simple. When you deliver the papers, you will ask one question and one question only. Is the spring ready for the planting? The answer you seek must be, the furrow is deep and the seeds are ready. That phrase confirms their commitment to immediate, unified resistance if the tea is landed. If they offer anything less, report it back to Abigail upon your return. She will notify us."
The task was clear. Josiah was no longer just a printer. He was a courier of sedition, carrying the literal, physical stirrings of radical thought out into the receptive countryside. He was tasked with confirming that the fallow ground of the previous chapter was indeed ready to bear the harvest of rebellion. Josiah received his directions, a small purse of coins for travel, and the scroll of potentially damning papers. He felt the weight of the moment, the transformation from passive witness to active participant. Abigail walked him to the side door. She pressed a small, smooth stone in his hand. "My grandmother gave me this, for luck. Keep it in your right pocket, and if you run into any trouble, you know nothing. You've only ever heard of the king's law." "And you?" Josiah asked in the dim light. "You sit in the center of the storm." "I manage the shelter," she countered. "Someone has to keep the cider flowing and the secrets quiet." "You look terrified, Josiah." "I am. I saw Hastings step on my type matrix yesterday. I felt the boot on my life. I don't want to feel it again." Abigail's expression softened. "That feeling, that humiliation, that is what this is about. You run that feeling out into the other towns, Josiah. Tell them what the king's men do on our streets. Show them that the only way to lift the boot is to stand up and say no together." She squeezed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Go now and be swift. The first T-ship is already heading toward the Cape. The fuse is lit." Josiah nodded, tucking the stone into his pocket. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, slipping back out onto the street. The night was cold, the air thick with fog and the promise of change. The sounds of the sleeping city, usually comforting, now seemed ominous. He was traveling from the heart of the resistance to the extremities of the colony, carrying the venom of radical thought. He turned south, away from the harbor and the looming specter of the incoming tea, heading toward the first town where he would whisper the dangerous question: "Is the spring ready for the planting?" The answer would determine if their protest would be a legal petition or the prelude to revolution.
The road out of Boston was less a symbol of connection and more a gauntlet of crown authority. Every mile marker was a reminder that this land, this path, was still subject to the distant will of George III. Josiah Reed traveled south, the cold sun rising to burn the fog away, revealing a landscape of skeletal trees and frost-hardened fields. His disguise was thin, a worn coat, a cheap leather bag, and a face that was perpetually pale from the soot and shadows of the print shop. He clutched the small, smooth stone Abigail had given him, its cold solidity the only anchor in his dizzying fear. The most immediate physical manifestation of the king's writ was not the redcoats in their fixed barracks, but the roving customs riders and the internal inspection posts. These weren't soldiers, but revenue officers, civilian agents of the crown, dressed in duller but equally authoritative blue and gray coats. They were the men who ensured that the king's revenue, the purse, was constantly replenished by the colonists' toil. Josiah was stopped twice before noon. The first was at a ferry crossing near Roxbury, where a gaunt, humorless revenue collector demanded to see his papers. "Where are you bound, boy, and what is your cargo?" the man demanded, his eyes sharp and suspicious. Josiah pulled out the legitimate debt notice from Mr. Arthur Vance, which Elias had prepared, a notice for a large sum of money owed by a distant client. He kept the revolutionary resolutions deep inside his coat. "Taunton, sir, delivering this to a client of Mr. Vance. It's a matter of debt collection. Urgent, or I wouldn't be traveling on this poor road." The revenue collector sneered, recognizing the name. "Vance, eh? A viper in the king's garden, that one. But he pays his debts. The wealthy always manage to evade the duties and pay their personal scores. Go on, but know this, every piece of paper in your pocket, every shilling in your purse, belongs to the king first." The encounter reinforced the core grievance. The king's law was absolute, overriding even the right to conduct basic private business. The crown had inserted itself into every transaction, every shipment, and every debt.
Josiah reached Plymouth late in the afternoon, the town already shadowed by the long light of dusk. His first contact was Elder Thomas Cromwell, a retired lawyer and former member of the Colonial Assembly, a man whose memory stretched back to the first great wave of economic defiance, almost a decade earlier. Cromwell's house was simple, yet furnished with the quiet dignity of old colonial wealth. He was seated by a roaring hearth, surrounded by leather-bound volumes, his hands knotted with age and arthritis. Josiah presented the resolutions and delivered the coded message. "I am sent by the Committee of Correspondence. Is the spring ready for the planting?" Cromwell did not rush his reply. He slowly took the papers, scanned them once, and then looked intently at Josiah. His eyes, though aged, were clear and sharp. "The furrow is deep and the seeds are ready, young man. Plymouth will stand firm. The tea will not land here either." He placed the resolutions on the fire and watched them turn to ash. "Always destroy the evidence, Josiah. The king's writ is a heavy hand, but we must not allow it to leave paper trails." Cromwell motioned for Josiah to sit. "You came from Boston, carrying a message of defiance against the tea duty. You are young, and perhaps you do not remember the first time the king tried to collect a tax, not on goods imported, but on the very paper of our lives." Cromwell's voice dropped to a low historical register, and Josiah realized he was receiving a lesson in the long, grinding history of the economic grievance. "The Stamp Act of 1665, Cromwell began, holding up a gnarled finger. "That was the king's first grave mistake. It was not a tax on rum or sugar, but on every legal document, every license, every newspaper, even every deck of playing cards. It was a tax on information, on commerce, on thought itself." He leaned closer, his eyes focused on the flames. "It was a masterstroke of economic tyranny. By taxing legal documents, the king effectively crippled the colonial legal system. If you wanted to prove a debt, sell a house, or even write a will, you paid the tax. It was inescapable. The purpose was clear: establish Parliament's right to external and internal taxation, regardless of colonial assembly consent." "What happened, sir?" Josiah asked, captivated. "We refused to use the stamps. Merchants boycotted British goods until trade halted completely. Our resistance was not violent, Josiah, it was economic. We strangled the king's purse until Parliament was forced to repeal the act the very next year. They withdrew the tax, but they did not surrender the principle." Cromwell pointed to a heavy volume on his shelf. "They passed the Declaratory Act immediately afterward, stating that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever." So the right to tax was never truly abandoned. Never. The king's writ remains unchanged. The current tea crisis is simply the latest and most cynical attempt to enforce that old claim. They think by giving us cheaper tea, we will forget the principle they reasserted in 1767 with the Townshend Acts, and again now with the Tea Act. Josiah spent the night resting, the weight of the historical context now layered onto his personal resentment. He understood that the current struggle wasn't a sudden quarrel, but the inevitable final battle of a 10-year economic siege. His next contact in Taunton was Mr. Alistair Finch, a local merchant who had been ruined by the Tea Act before the ships even docked. Finch was a nervous, desperate man, unlike the philosophizing Cromwell. Finch represented the raw, personal toll of the king's writ. "The Tea Act is brilliant in its cruelty, Josiah," Finch explained, running a hand through his thinning hair in distress. "It is not just a tax, it's a government-backed monopoly designed to destroy independent business. Let me explain the 4 steps that are crippling us."
Finch used his counting house desk to illustrate his points. 1. The subsidy, the unfair advantage. The East India Company, nearing bankruptcy, is allowed to ship tea directly to America, bypassing British tariffs that every other tea shipper must pay. This alone makes their tea cheaper in Boston than it is in London. 2. The duty, the trap. They charge us a paltry 3 pence per pound duty upon entry into our harbor. It is a small tax, but it is the poison pill. If we pay it, we recognize Parliament's right to tax us internally forever. 3. The consignees, the king's agents. They didn't use just any captains. They appointed specific colonial merchants, Governor Hutchinson's own sons among them, as the official consignees. These are the men who receive the tea and are legally bound to pay the duty. 4. The ruin, the bottom line. My warehouses, Josiah, are full of legal Dutch tea, smuggled without paying the tax. But when the East India Company tea comes in, even with the 3 pence duty, it is still cheaper than my stock. I cannot compete. My life savings, my business, my family's future, all ruined by a king's writ designed to save a distant corporation. Finch slammed his fist onto the ledger, his voice breaking. They demand we choose between ruin and slavery. We must either pay the small tax and acknowledge our enslavement, or we must be economically destroyed by the monopoly. There is no third way unless we prevent the landing entirely. The contrast was stark. Arthur Vance, the wealthy Boston merchant, cared about principle because his fortune was large enough to survive the loss. Alistair Finch cared about survival because the act meant immediate destitution. But both men, for entirely different reasons tied to the merchant's purse, were now unified against the king's writ. Josiah delivered his resolutions and received the same fierce, coded reply. The furrow is deep and the seeds are ready. Josiah's return trip was faster, spurred by the urgency of the approaching ships and the raw fear he had witnessed in Finch. He was no longer carrying mere documents. He was carrying confirmation that the entire surrounding countryside was aligned with Boston's defiance. But the journey back was not without incident. Just outside Dedham, the main road bottlenecked around a customs checkpoint, not for imported goods, but for enforcing the often forgotten Revenue Act of 1767, one of the Townshend Acts, which established the American Board of Customs Commissioners. At the checkpoint, a group of travelers was being harassed by a particularly heavy-set commissioner named Bartholomew, who wore the authority of the crown like a second, more tighter skin. Bartholomew had his hands on the reins of a farmer's wagon, his boots planted in the mud. "I told you, farmer, your load of grain is too heavy by the metric standards of His Majesty's Royal Weights and Measures," Bartholomew bellowed, his face red with exertion and indignation. "It is my usual load, Commissioner," the farmer pleaded, a tired man with calloused hands. "It is for my own family, not for sale." "Nonsense! Anything crossing this thoroughfare is subject to inspection and, if necessary, fine or seizure. You are concealing something, perhaps." Bartholomew grabbed a sack and savagely ripped it open with a knife. The grain spilled onto the wet road. It was an arbitrary act of power, a demonstration that the king's writ was not just about collecting revenue, but about maintaining control. By enforcing obscure or unfair regulations, the commissioners instilled fear and demonstrated the complete lack of colonial autonomy. Josiah, frozen 20 yards back, pulled his cap low. He felt the cold pressure of the small stone in his pocket. He was carrying a verbal conspiracy. The commissioner was demonstrating the physical cost of that conspiracy. Just then, a young woman, a rider on a fast bay mare, appeared from the north. She had the look of a country girl, but her eyes were alert.
As she approached the checkpoint, she seemed to recognize the situation. Instead of slowing, she urged her horse faster. "Halt! In the king's name!" Bartholomew yelled, turning his attention away from the farmer to this new target. The woman didn't halt. Instead, she swerved her horse sharply, sending a plume of muddy water directly into Bartholomew's face and over his finely tailored coat. Bartholomew sputtered and raged. "You'll pay for that, you colonial wench! Guards!" But the damage was done. In the resulting chaos, Bartholomew struggling with his muddied vision, the farmer quickly seizing the chance to move his wagon, the two guards momentarily distracted, Josiah saw his opportunity. He sprinted past the checkpoint, hugging the side of the road and melting into the surrounding woods before the commissioner could regain his sight or his authority. He paused when he reached a small rise, watching the bay mare disappear in the distance. He realized she had not been merely an impetuous girl. She had been a planned diversion. She was part of the network, a rider helping to keep the lines of communication open, fighting the king's writ with cunning and mud. Josiah returned to Boston under the cover of a dense, welcome darkness, slipping back into the city via the Neck, a narrow causeway that connected the peninsula to the mainland. He delivered his verbal report to Abigail at the Green Dragon, who was waiting anxiously in the kitchen, kneading bread dough as if her life depended on the rhythm. "Plymouth and Taunton, they are ready," Josiah confirmed, giving her the full coded response. "The furrow is deep, and the seeds are ready." Abigail's face softened in relief. "Good! We are unified. Now the full pressure falls on the governor." She offered him a cup of hot broth. "Mr. Finch was ruined, Abigail, completely ruined by the act. And I saw the customs commissioner Bartholomew indebted him. He was tearing apart a farmer's load of grain over a few ounces." "That is the system, Josiah," Abigail said, stirring the broth. "The king's writ, the law, doesn't just exist to collect money. It exists to create a class of men, the commissioners, who live off of our misfortune. They are paid commissions on every fine they collect, every ship they seize, and every duty they process. They get rich on the fear of ruin." She continued, detailing the corrosive effect of the customs system. "The commissioners are the king's new colonial aristocracy. They wear fine silks, they purchase the best homes, and they hire the most expensive servants, all paid for by the penalties levied against the colonial merchant's purse. That is the true weight of the tax, not the 3 pence on the tea, but the thousands of pounds that go into maintaining the tools of our oppression." Josiah drank the broth, feeling the warmth spread through his chilled body. The physical and the financial were now inseparable in his mind. The humiliation of the corporal's boot on his printing matrix was the military wing of the same oppression that the revenue commissioner represented with his arbitrary laws. They were both drawing sustenance from the same source, the colonial purse. "The Dartmouth is due any day now," Abigail whispered, her hands still kneading the dough, a nervous energy flowing through her. "The committee meets again tomorrow. They must decide the final course of action. They have petitioned, they have argued, they have organized the country. Now the law says the tea must be landed and the duty paid within 20 days of arrival, or the ships and cargo are subject to seizure by the customs house." "I know what that means," Josiah stated, a cold certainty settling over him. Abigail nodded, looking toward the dark back room of the tavern where the leaders would meet again at dawn. "They must. The king's writ has given us the deadline, and the merchant's purse has given us the motive. Now we wait for the spark." The fallow ground had been turned. The seeds of radical thought had been planted across the countryside. Now the deadline was set, and the stage was ready for the ultimate confrontation between authority and liberty.
The morning after Josiah's return from the countryside, the air in Elias Thorne's print shop was thick with the scent of pine smoke and stale coffee. But overriding the familiar smells was the less tangible yet far more pervasive atmosphere of anticipation. The Dartmouth was reported to be near the coast. The clock on the 20-day deadline had begun its relentless tick. Josiah, having delivered his coded confirmations from Plymouth and Taunton, was exhausted but invigorated. He was no longer just a printer's apprentice. He was a confirmed participant in a unified defiance. He moved quietly around the shop, carefully cleaning the type, while Elias, ignoring the rising stacks of legitimate customs papers, was absorbed in the back room. This back room, small and rarely used for printing, was Elias's true sanctuary. A library crammed with books and pamphlets, many of them smuggled past the Crown's censors. These were the works that formed the unseen lineage of freedom, the intellectual weaponry that armed the colonial mind long before muskets were shouldered. Elias called Josiah in. He was seated among stacks of worn leather and brittle paper, holding a book with a cracked spine. "Josiah," Elias began, tapping the cover of the book, "you have confirmed that the common man is ready to fight for his purse. But tell me, do you know why the tax on tea is not merely a financial inconvenience, but a moral outrage?" "Because it is taxation without representation, Master Elias," he recited, the common rallying cry. "Yes, the immediate political reason, but the philosophical reason is far deeper. It goes back to this man." Elias opened the book, John Locke's Two Treatises of Government, 1690. Locke did not invent the concept of freedom, but he provided the language for it. He argued that all men are born with natural rights granted not by king or parliament, but by God, specifically the rights to life, liberty, and property. Elias stood and used the dusty stacks of paper to illustrate his point. "Property, Josiah, is the key to all the others. Locke states that property is the fruit of a man's own labor. If I toil and the product of that toil is mine, then I am free. But if a distant power, the king, the parliament, can take that property without my consent, then they own my labor. If they own my labor, they own my life. Therefore, the moment Parliament taxes our commerce without our elected consent, they are not just taking 3 pence, they are asserting absolute dominion over our very existence." Josiah, leaning against a workbench, absorbed the lesson. The arbitrary imposition he had witnessed, Corporal Hastings' boot on his matrix, Commissioner Bartholomew's seizure of the farmer's grain, was not just bad governance, it was a fundamental violation of a natural, God-given contract. "This concept is the social contract theory," Elias continued, placing the Locke volume back in its place. "The people consent to be governed only so long as the government protects their rights. When the government, the legislators, endeavor to destroy the property of the people, Locke states, and I quoted this to you the other day, they place themselves in a state of war with the people. At that moment, the people are freed from any further obedience and have the right to establish a new government." The idea was explosive. It justified not just protest, but complete armed revolution. It transformed colonial rebellion from petty grievance into a sacred duty. Later that afternoon, Dr. Joseph Warren, elegant and composed, arrived at the print shop, ostensibly to discuss the final printing of the town meeting announcement, but truly to consult with Elias and check on Josiah's readiness. Warren represented the classical republicanism strand of colonial thought, the belief that a virtuous, self-governing citizenry was the only defense against inevitable corruption and tyranny. He didn't carry Locke, he carried an aura of stern moral purpose. "Elias, Josiah, your reports from the South are heartening. The people understand the economic threat. Now we must ensure they understand the moral threat," Warren said, his voice quiet but intense. Warren pulled out a pamphlet, well thumbed and worn.
This, Josiah, has done more to prepare the colonial mind than Locke or Rousseau combined, because it spoke directly to the common man's fear of corruption. The pamphlet was Cato's Letters, 1720 to 1723, a series of essays by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, widely reprinted throughout the colonies. Cato, you see, was a Roman philosopher who stood against Caesar's tyranny. These authors argued that power is constantly corrupting, Warren explained, pacing the small room. They taught that liberty is a fragile thing, constantly under threat from powerful, self-interested elites like the royal governors and customs commissioners you encountered. Warren fixed his intellectual gaze on Josiah. The king's writ, the arbitrary laws, the fees, the monopolies, it is designed to corrupt us. It creates a class of wealthy officials, like Commissioner Bartholomew, who grow fat on our fines. It creates wealthy merchants, like Vance, who would gladly pay the tax if it meant crushing their competitors. This system destroys virtue. He defined the term carefully. Virtue is the cornerstone of a free republic. It is the willingness of a citizen to sacrifice his self-interest for the public good. When you paid the 3 pence duty on tea, you might save a little money in the short term, but you sacrifice the entire future of colonial liberty. That is the definition of corruption and moral decay. Warren argued that the true goal of resistance was not just avoiding the tax, but purifying the colonial character. The refusal to drink the tea, even the refusal to allow it to land, was an act of moral self-defense. It was a commitment to public virtue over private gain. This is why the Sons of Liberty demand the tea be sent back, even if it is wasted. It is not about money, Josiah. It is about a spiritual cleansing. It is about demonstrating that we are worthy of self-governance because we can resist the temptation of cheap goods purchased at the price of our freedom. Later, Josiah went to the Green Dragon Tavern to help Abigail with the afternoon chores. The atmosphere in the main room was different now, subdued, watchful. Everyone knew the Dartmouth was near. Abigail found him wiping down the long pine counter. More lectures from the great minds, Josiah? Was it Cicero or perhaps the great Mr. Locke today? She asked, a familiar teasing tone in her voice.
Locke and Cato, Josiah replied, carefully folding a linen cloth. They speak of property, virtue, and the destruction of the social contract, but sometimes it feels like they are talking about philosophers in Athens, not dock workers in Boston. Abigail leaned against the counter, her hands crossed over her apron. That's the difference, Josiah. They write the theory in Latin. We live the practice in sweat. The unseen lineage of freedom is simple here. It's the right to live your life without fear. She detailed her own version of Lockean rights, stripped down to the colonial reality. What is property to a man like Silas, the dock worker? It's his health, his strength, and the wages he earns. When the king's law dictates that the East India Company can undercut all colonial shipping, Silas loses his job. The king has taken his property, his ability to labor, without his consent. What is liberty to a woman like me? She continued, her eyes sweeping the empty tavern. It's the right to choose who comes into my house, who I serve, and who I can speak freely to. If a redcoat can demand service, if a commissioner can demand my ledgers, then my tavern is not my own. My liberty is a phantom. And life? Josiah asked. Abigail's face hardened. The light disappeared from her eyes. Life is cheap in a king's service. Remember the massacre? 5 years ago, soldiers fired on our citizens for throwing snowballs. The king's writ says that when soldiers are called, they will defend the king's revenue and the king's agents. If we resist the tax, the king will send more soldiers, and then our lives are forfeit simply for asserting our rights. Abigail's pragmatic philosophy was the necessary translation of Enlightenment theory.
Locke provided the justification for revolution. Cato provided the moral mandate, but Abigail provided the immediate, visceral reason to risk everything. The fight was not for abstract rights, but for the tangible freedom to run a press, manage a tavern, or work the docks without the fear of a red coat or a fine. The next day, November 29th, the Committee of Correspondence met at the Old South Meeting House, a massive crowd of 2,000 Bostonians, far too many to fit in the Green Dragon. The first meeting of its kind, it was an organized, formal demonstration of popular will, backed by the confirmed support of the surrounding towns. Josiah stood near the back, having assisted Elias in posting the final stark broadside. "Friends, brethren, countrymen, that edict which is intended to enslave this country has arrived in this harbor." Samuel Adams took the podium, his voice ringing with the virtue and purpose that Warren had championed. He cited no philosophers, but his rhetoric was steeped in their ideas. He spoke of the unalienable right of the people to protect their property and the moral duty to resist corruption. The political goal was to force Governor Thomas Hutchinson to grant the tea ships a customs clearance that would allow them to leave the harbor without paying the duty. Hutchinson, however, was in a double bind. He was one of the tea consignees, his sons were heavily invested, and he was the king's chief executive. He could not and would not yield. Dr. Warren then rose to present the ultimate philosophical resolution, the mandate for action. "We have petitioned the consignees. They refused. We have petitioned the collector of customs. He refused. We have petitioned the governor himself. He has refused to order the vessel back to sea." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy over the assembly. "The law dictates that the duty must be paid in 3 weeks, or the tea will be seized by the customs house and landed by force." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy over the assembly. "We must now choose. Do we submit to economic slavery and pay the duty, thus sacrificing the birthright of liberty for the sake of cheap drink, or do we act to save the principle?" A collective roar of "no duty, no landing" swept the great hall. Adams then presented the final radical resolution, a synthesis of Locke and Cato. Since the government, the king's appointed officials, had clearly failed to protect the rights and property of the people were now authorized by natural law to act in self-preservation. I move that the inhabitants of Boston and the surrounding towns view the arrival of the tea ships as a direct attack upon the liberties of America, and that we, as the assembled sovereign body of the people, pledge to prevent the landing and payment of that tea by any means necessary. The vote was unanimous, a deafening swell of affirmation. The philosophical foundation had been laid, the lineage of freedom confirmed. The people in that meeting house declared themselves the highest authority in the land, overriding the king's writ. The meeting ended with a decree. 200 men would keep constant watch on Griffin's Wharf to ensure the tea was not secretly offloaded. The final confrontation was only days away. Elias, exhausted but elated, clapped Josiah on the shoulder as they left the meeting house. "You see, Josiah, we are not hooligans. We are philosophers with dirty hands. We acted on the principles of the ancient Greeks and the modern Enlightenment. The king may have the law, but we have the moral foundation." Josiah looked back at the Old South Meeting House, now dark against the winter sky. He carried the full weight of the revolution in his heart. The simple debt notice he carried to Taunton, the fear he felt under Hastings' boot, the desperation of the ruined merchant Alistair Finch were all now wrapped up in the grand, sweeping ideas of Locke and Cato. he realized the true meaning of the unseen lineage of freedom. It was the intellectual engine that allowed an apprentice printer, a dock worker, a tavern keeper, a merchant, and a lawyer to view the destruction of property not as a crime, but as a righteous necessity. They were not merely defying a tax, they were fulfilling a philosophical duty to tear up the failed social contract and plant the seeds of a republic. The Dartmouth was waiting in the harbor, its cargo a ticking philosophical time bomb. The next step was no longer a matter of debate, but of inevitable, dangerous action.
The cold of December 16, 1773 was not merely meteorological, it was the chilling realization of an impending, unavoidable collision. The 20-day deadline for the Dartmouth to clear customs, pay the hated duty, or face seizure by the Crown's agents was set to expire at midnight. 2 other tea ships, the Eleanor and the Beaver, had since arrived and were anchored alongside the Dartmouth at Griffin's Wharf. Boston held its breath. Josiah Reed felt the anxiety in the pit of his stomach. He had spent the morning helping Elias print neutral, utterly innocuous pamphlets, a calculated performance for the Crown's spies. Now, in the late afternoon, he stood with Abigail near the back entrance of the Green Dragon Tavern. She was handing out thick slices of bread and cheese to men gathering quietly, their faces solemn. "They are like a flock of sheep being pushed into the pen," Josiah murmured to Abigail, watching the men slip away in small, nervous groups toward the Old South Meeting House. Abigail wiped her hands on her apron. "No, Josiah, sheep panic. These men are marching with purpose. They know the consequence of what they are about to affirm. The committee has exhausted every political maneuver. This is the last stop before the fall." The plan, settled in the dark rooms of the Green Dragon, was for a final, massive public meeting. Its explicit goal, to hear the report on Governor Hutchinson's final refusal to issue the pass that would allow the tea ships to leave the harbor and return to England without paying the duty. Its implicit goal was to provide the collective, moral sanction necessary for the subsequent act of irreversible defiance. "I am going to the meeting house," Josiah told her. "I have to see it through." Abigail did not try to stop him. "Be careful. If the fuse is lit tonight, the king's men will remember every face they see. Stay to the shadows and listen carefully. The language will change tonight. It will stop being the language of law and start being the language of war." The sheer scale of the gathering was breathtaking. When Josiah reached the Old South Meeting House, he found it overflowing. Every pew, every gallery, every inch of standing room was packed. The doors could not be closed, and the crowd spilled out onto the streets, with thousands more listening intently through the open windows. Historians would later estimate the crowd at nearly 7,000 people, the largest political assembly in the history of the colonies, representing not just Boston, but the unified will of the surrounding towns Josiah had helped to rouse. The meeting was chaired by Colonel John Hancock, the aristocratic smuggler whose wealth and prestige gave the rebellion a veneer of respectability. But the true orchestrators sat below him: Samuel Adams, Dr. Joseph Warren, and Elias Thorne, seated at the clerk's table. The mood was heavy, silent, and expectant. Josiah found a spot pressed against the back wall, feeling the collective tension of thousands of hearts beating in rhythm. The final act of political theater began. Dr. Warren rose to summarize the 3 weeks of agonizing negotiation and failed petitions. He recounted how the consignees, including Governor Hutchinson's own sons, had refused to resign their posts, and how the collector of customs had refused to issue the clearance required to send the ships back to England without paying the duty. "We have petitioned, we have reasoned, we have pleaded the cause of liberty before the king's men," Warren's voice resonated through the large hall,
And what has been the response? Silence, and ultimately, absolute refusal. The crowd rumbled, a sound like a distant approaching storm. Warren then pointed out the immutable deadline. By midnight tonight, if that tea remains in the harbor, the customs house, under the king's writ, will seize the cargo, land it, and pay the duty. If the duty is paid, the principal is lost. We will be permanently enslaved to taxation without representation. Adams then rose, his usual threadbare appearance lending him an air of Puritan moral authority. "We have done all that men can do to avert this crisis," he thundered. "We have used the law. We have used petition. We have used the voice of this, the most powerful assembly of free men in the colony. There is only one final legal act remaining to us. We must appeal to the governor one last time. We must send him a final, unequivocal demand to grant the ships their clearance papers before the sun sets." A massive, unified motion was passed. A messenger, Captain Francis Roch, part owner of the Dartmouth and now a frightened colonial pawn, was ordered to ride immediately to Governor Hutchinson's country house in Milton, some 9 miles away. The crowd settled into a restless, agonizing wait. The meeting recessed, but no one left. It was a demonstration of immense patience and self-control, proof that the protesters were not a mob, but a sovereign body capable of executing a political decision. Josiah felt a powerful sense of unity. They were no longer subjects petitioning a king. They were citizens awaiting the final verdict of their highest officer. The sun began its slow descent behind the hills of Milton. The light filtering through the high windows of the meeting house turned from gold to cold gray. The air was thick with breath and the smell of whale oil lamps being lit. It was nearly 6 p.m. when Captain Roch returned, his face pale, his coat dusted with the frost of the night ride. The silence in the meeting house was absolute. Colonel Hancock called the meeting to order. "Captain Roch, report your message." Roch spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, choked with fear. "I have delivered your request to His Excellency Governor Hutchinson. He has asked me to reply that he cannot, consistently with the duty he owes to the king, grant any permit for the vessel to pass the fortress until the duties are paid." A collective gasp swept through the thousands of people. The final door was shut. The governor, having tied his fate to the king's revenue and the interests of his own family, had refused to yield to the unified will of the people. The social contract, as described by Locke, was irrevocably broken. The government had officially placed itself in a state of war with the people. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the air changing from passive tension to explosive resolve. Samuel Adams, seated at the clerk's table, slowly rose. He waited for the deafening roar of outrage to subside, letting the silence maximize the impact of his words. His voice, usually reedy, was sharp and clean. He looked out over the massive crowd, his eyes locking onto the high gallery. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he brought his hand down, slapping the table one final resounding time. He delivered the code, the final verdict of the Sons of Liberty. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was the signal. The roar that followed was not of despair, but of liberation. Before the sound could even fully subside, a war whoop erupted from the gallery, a sound designed to mimic the cry of a Mohawk warrior. The gallery doors burst open, and a crowd of approximately 150 men, their faces smeared with soot and paint and wearing rough blankets and feathers to disguise themselves as Native Americans, poured into the main hall. They were dock workers, artisans, and merchants, the Sons of Liberty, now transformed into the Sons of Neptune. Their transformation was purposeful. They intended to make the destruction of the tea appear to be the act of an untamed, uncivilized force,
protecting the identities of the true perpetrators. Josiah found Elias and Dr. Warren moving quickly toward the back exit. Elias clapped Josiah on the shoulder. "Go, boy! Go to Griffin's Wharf! Witness this! This is the first chapter of the American story written in real, dangerous ink." Josiah swept up in the urgent surge, followed the stream of men out of the meeting house and onto the freezing streets.
As they marched toward the harbor, the disguise and the ferocity of the men were startling. Among them, Josiah spotted Silas, the dock worker, his massive form draped in a blanket, carrying a dull, heavy hatchet. He also saw Arthur Vance, the wealthy merchant, shedding his expensive coat for a simple, dirt-smudged disguise, a physical act of renunciation of his own comfortable class. Josiah looked down at his own hands. He had no costume, no weapon, only the small, smooth stone Abigail had given him, cold in his pocket. He was not a destroyer, but a witness and a symbol of the intellectual foundation they were defending. He quickened his pace, joining the silent, purposeful marchers. The march was silent, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. Thousands of citizens followed the Mohawks, lining the docks not to interfere, but to stand as silent guards, their sheer numbers ensuring that the British patrols and customs commissioners could not intervene. At Griffin's Wharf, the three ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, rode low in the water. The Mohawk-dressed men streamed aboard the vessels. Josiah found a place near the gangplank, standing next to a nervous, pale Captain Roch, who was powerless to stop the proceedings. The operation was methodical. The men demanded the keys to the hold and ropes. The crews, intimidated by the crowd on the shore and the determined force on their decks, offered no resistance. Josiah watched the first chest of tea, a heavy wooden crate stamped with the East India Company's insignia, being hauled onto the deck. It was not dumped directly overboard. That would be messy and potentially implicate them. Instead, Silas, with a grunt of exertion, brought his hatchet down, splitting the lid open with a clean, sharp crack. The scent of dry, black tea, normally a comforting aroma, now smelled like revolution. Silas then grabbed the chest and, with a heave, emptied its contents into the dark, freezing water of the harbor. The destruction was not mindless vandalism. The men were meticulously careful. They ensured that only the tea was destroyed. No other cargo was touched. No part of the ships, save for a broken padlock that was later replaced, was damaged. The crowd was silent, occasionally letting out a low, satisfied murmur as a chest was emptied. It was a ritual of political and philosophical purification. Josiah realized the depth of the commitment required by Dr. Warren's lesson on virtue and property. The destruction of this tea, estimated to be worth 10,000 pounds, an immense sum, was an act of profound self-sacrifice. They were destroying valuable property to save the abstract principle of their own property rights. They were proving, beyond any doubt, that their commitment to liberty transcended their desire for economic gain. He thought of Alastair Finch, ruined by the Tea Act. He thought of the threepence duty. They were annihilating the commodity to deny the king his 3 pence and to save the livelihoods of men like Finch. For nearly 3 hours, the rhythmic sounds of hatchets, the breaking of wood, and the splash of tea hitting the water filled the night. Josiah watched Silas and Vance, the dock worker and the merchant, working side by side, united in their refusal to be ruled by distant tyranny. Just after 9 p.m., the work was done. Over 340 chests of tea had been methodically destroyed, turning the water near the wharf black and oily. The men, their faces streaked with paint and sweat, filed off the ships. Before departing,
They forced the captains to open their manifests and confirmed that nothing but the tea had been damaged. The political statement was complete. Josiah walked back toward the print shop, the city strangely quiet. The air, usually smelling of salt, now carried a faint, sweet, decaying smell of damp tea. The streets were deserted, the silent, supportive crowds had dissolved. He found Elias in the back room, waiting by the faint glow of the whale oil lamp. Elias was not elated. He looked utterly drained, the philosophical weight of the evening resting heavy on his shoulders. "It is done, Master Elias," Josiah stated, standing near the door. "Yes, it is done," Elias repeated slowly. He walked to the window and stared out into the darkness of the occupied city. "The king will view this as an act of criminal destruction of property, an act of open defiance." "But we had to," Josiah argued, the raw energy of the harbor still thrumming in his veins. Elias turned back, his expression grim. "You are right. Philosophically, morally, it was necessary. The unseen lineage of freedom, Locke and Cato, demanded that we resist the destruction of our liberty. But politically, we have crossed a line. We have moved from protest to rebellion. There is no going back now." He walked over to a shelf and pulled down a large, untouched volume. "Until tonight, the crown could pretend we were simply unruly subjects, easily managed by a few troops and a few acts of parliament. But tonight, Josiah, we declared ourselves a separate, sovereign entity. We superseded the king's law in his own colony. We have stolen the authority to govern ourselves." He emphasized the gravity of the shift. "This action will not be met with new taxes. It will be met with war. The king cannot afford to allow this precedent to stand. He must punish us, crush us, or lose all his American colonies." Josiah looked down at his own dust-covered boots, felt a cold certainty settle over him. He was no longer just an apprentice printer setting type for pamphlets. He was part of a collective body that had just committed an act of war against the greatest empire in the world. The act, born of Locke's justification of property rights and Warren's call for classical virtue, had ignited the fuse. "What do we do now, Master Elias?" Elias looked around the print shop, the air still smelling of ink and lead. "We prepare, Josiah. We print the news of this great deed and send it across the continent. We make our stand undeniable, and we wait for the king's inevitable, terrible response. The fight for the merchant's purse is over. The fight for life and liberty has just begun." He handed Josiah a piece of clean, white parchment. "Go. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we print the news of the great deed. The world must know that on the night of December 16th, 1773, the citizens of Boston, in defense of their liberty, destroyed the king's tea. We have reached the point of no return." Josiah nodded, clutching the parchment, feeling the truth of Elias's words. The quiet night was deceptive. The fuse was lit at the wharf. The long, dark night of the rebellion was now upon them.
The weeks following the Boston Tea Party were marked by a tense, brittle silence. The air was frigid, and the harbor, though seemingly clear, held a metallic tang of tea and fear. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, paralyzed by indecision, had left the customs house and the king's officials reeling. They were desperate for direction from London, but the winter sea crossing meant any official response would take months. This delay, however, was a deception. The Royal Navy doubled its patrols, and the king's troops, though still confined to their barracks, felt like a silent, tightening noose around the neck of the town. Rumors, more deadly than musket balls, flew through the narrow streets. Warrants were being prepared, informers were being paid,
and the crown intended to seize the property of every man connected to the destruction of the tea. Josiah Reed, Elias Thorne, and Abigail met 3 nights after the event in the print shop. Elias had been furiously printing pamphlets summarizing the justification for the Tea Party, that it was an act of political necessity, not riotous anarchy. But his usually steady hand now trembled with exhaustion and worry. "They will come for us, Elias," Abigail stated simply, sitting on an overturned barrel, wrapping her shawl tighter against the damp cold. "Hutchinson knows who the orchestrators are. Hancock, Adams, Warren, they are safe for now, they are too public. But the men who carried the hatchets, the ones who spread the word and secured the crowd, they are targets." Elias nodded, gesturing toward a large ledger book on the counter, the one where he tracked his debts and inventory. "I have been forced to destroy this. It contains names, contacts, and transactions, all potentially incriminating. Everything must now be committed to memory or coded in a language only we understand." "That is our task, then," Josiah said, stepping forward. He was still reeling from the gravity of the deed, but the fear had sharpened his focus. "If the Sons of Liberty are too visible, we must become the invisible core, a shadow." Elias sighed, rubbing his temples. "The Sons of Liberty are a public club, Josiah. They argue in taverns and publish their grievances. We need something smaller, faster, and utterly secure. We need a committee of correspondence, but one dedicated only to intelligence and covert action." Over the next few weeks, under the heavy shadow of the anticipated royal response, they formed their secret cell. Elias called it the unseen thread, because their purpose was to connect and draw together the scattered threads of opposition that the crown sought to sever. Their headquarters was the small, cold cellar beneath the print shop. It was damp and smelled of earth and old paper, but it was secure. "Our roles must be absolute," Elias declared one cold evening, standing beneath a single flickering candle. "I cannot risk my freedom or the press by being the point of failure." He set out their mandates. 1. Elias Thorne, the Codemaster. His role was the protection of information and the creation of propaganda. He would design the ciphers, write the inflammatory yet technically anonymous essays, and coordinate the printing and distribution network outside of Boston. He was the mind of the cell. Abigail, the network weaver. Her role was the most dangerous: intelligence and communication within Boston. Working under the guise of her bakery deliveries, she would move silently between the dock workers, the taverns, the British barracks, selling bread to the officers' wives, and the homes of the wealthy merchants. She was the eyes and ears of the cell. Josiah Reed, the courier and organizer. His speed and his reputation as Elias's apprentice gave him a passable reason to move about. He would carry Elias's coded messages to the provincial towns, secure safe houses, and, crucially, identify and vet new recruits. He was the arm of the cell. Our commitment to this cause with our lives and the understanding that discovery means not just prison, but the gallows, Elias said, his voice solemn. Before we proceed, we must take an oath, not before God, but before the principles we defend. Josiah and Abigail stood side by side, the light of the candle casting their shadows tall and monstrous on the rough stone wall. Elias held up a small, worn copy of John Locke's 2 Treatises of Government, the book Josiah had first encountered months ago. "I swear by this principle," Elias began, holding the book aloft, "that I will hold the fundamental law of nature to be the preservation of society and as far as will consist with the public good of every person in it." Abigail spoke next, her voice firm and clear. "I swear that I will never acknowledge that government has any end but the good of the community, and that I shall resist any power used to subject me to arbitrary will." Then it was Josiah's turn. The words Elias had printed, the concepts he had taught, flowed naturally now. I swear that I will transmit all intelligence faithfully, preserve the identity of my compatriots above all else, and if seized by the king's men, I will suffer death before betraying the liberty of this colony. To the cause, and to the death if necessary." Elias nodded, his face softening with a look of finality. "This is the only legal contract that now binds us. The oath on midnight air. We are no longer subjects to the king. We are citizens of a concept." They extinguished the candle, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. The contract was sealed by the absence of light and the promise of silence. Abigail's new role immediately proved the most effective. No one suspected the woman with the flour-dusted hands, the fresh-baked scent clinging to her shawl. She used her bakery deliveries to move through every strata of Boston society. One morning, she delivered a rye loaf to the barracks of the 29th Regiment. While accepting payment from the wife of a British captain, she heard snippets of conversation from the officers' mess. The general says the response will be punitive. A blockade of the harbor, perhaps. No, worse, I heard they mean to abolish the assembly itself. Shut down the government of the colony entirely? Abigail's heart pounded. Abolish the assembly. That would be the end of all representative government, the true destruction of the republic. She smiled politely, accepted her shilling, and walked out, the vital piece of intelligence hidden beneath the mundane routine of commerce. Later that day, she visited Arthur Vance, the merchant who had helped dump the tea. Vance was terrified, moving his most valuable goods to his country estate. "They will confiscate everything, Abigail. If this news from London is true, they won't just punish the men, they'll punish the whole colony. I heard the port itself will be closed until we repay the East India Company." Vance's information, closure of the port, paired perfectly with the officers' talk of abolishing the assembly. The picture Elias had feared was rapidly forming. The king was planning to enact not just punishment, but coercive acts, designed to make an example of Boston for the entire continent. That evening, when she reported back to Elias and Josiah in the cellar, she didn't write down a single name or date. She spoke the facts, clean and precise. The word is coercion. They will shut the port of Boston to starve the city into submission, and they will take away all our self-governance. They mean to isolate and neuter us. Elias's eyes glittered. Isolation is our enemy. We need connection. Josiah, your work begins now. We need to reach the other colonies. If Boston falls, the resistance dies everywhere.
Josiah's first mission was to ride to Philadelphia, a colossal undertaking in the winter. He wasn't carrying a banner. He was carrying a pamphlet that appeared to be a dry, philosophical treatise on ancient Greek economics, entitled "The Uses of Barley and the Price of Salt." The treatise itself was the code book. Elias had painstakingly crafted a visionaire cipher based on specific words and page numbers within the book. The real message, hidden in a single folded sheet of parchment tucked into the spine, contained the details of the impending coercive acts and a desperate plea for unified resistance. "You are taking this to Benjamin Franklin's son-in-law, Richard Bauchet, a printer in Philadelphia," Elias instructed. "He is a trusted contact. You will hand him the book, the note, and say only this: the salt of Boston is bitter now, and the barley yield is low. He will understand the need for urgency." The journey was brutal. Josiah rode an aging, hardy mare, pushing her through snow-choked roads and muddy trails. He passed through the smaller towns he had organized months earlier, leaving behind Elias's propaganda pamphlets like silent seeds of dissent. He rode by day, trusting his appearance as a simple apprentice would deflect suspicion. He slept in cold, anonymous taverns by night, guarding his book with a fanatic's zeal. In New York, a heavily garrisoned city, his cover was nearly blown. A British officer, bored and drunk, stopped him near the docks. "What's the cargo, boy?" the officer slurred, gesturing to Josiah's saddlebag. "A text, sir."
Greek economy. My master requires it for his work. The officer laughed, pulling the book out. Barley and salt. Dull stuff, eh? You Boston rebels are a dreary lot. He flipped through the pages, his thumb passing right over the folded parchment in the spine. He threw the book back at Josiah. Be gone, printer's boy, and tell your master the king is coming for him. Josiah rode out of New York with an adrenaline-laced terror, the officer's threat ringing in his ears. The officer didn't know how close he had been to ending the revolution before it began. The sight of Philadelphia's broad, orderly streets and bustling commerce was a shock after the gloom of Boston. Here, life seemed normal, the threat distant. This was exactly what the king intended, to isolate Boston so the other colonies would look away. He found Richard Bachet's print shop, a larger, grander operation than Elias's. Bachet was a serious, sharp-eyed man. Josiah delivered the message, his voice hoarse from the journey. The salt of Boston is bitter now, and the barley yield is low. Bachet did not flinch. He took the book and the parchment. He dismissed Josiah with a curt nod, his mind already working on the cipher. Josiah waited in a coffee house nearby, the clock ticking slowly. 2 hours later, Bachet found him. The message is clear, Bachet said, leaning close. A blockade, the removal of the charter government. They call them the Intolerable Acts. They mean to make Boston bleed. Bachet lowered his voice, the weight of the moment pressing down. Franklin has warned us this would happen. This is not just about Boston's tea. This is the king testing the nerve of the entire continent. If we allow Boston to fall, we lose everything. Master Elias needs a commitment. Will Philadelphia stand with Boston? Josiah pleaded. Bachet placed a hand on Josiah's shoulder, his grip firm. You go back and tell your master this. The Pennsylvania Assembly will convene a Continental Congress. We will call every colony. If the king is trying to divide us, we will answer with absolute unity. We are all Bostonians now. This was the commitment they needed. Not just anger, but organizational structure, a coordinated body to stand against the king's parliament. Josiah rode back to Massachusetts with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer a fearful youth. He was the bearer of the Continental Congress. He arrived back in Boston in the deepening cold of early March 1774. He found Elias and Abigail in the cellar. Elias was setting new type, his fingers moving with grim determination. Josiah delivered Bachet's message. They will call a Congress. They will stand with us. Elias stopped, letting his tools drop onto the lead type. The sound was a small, decisive clang. He looked at Josiah, his eyes shining with relief and pride. You have done more, Josiah, than any orator or politician. You have laid the first stone of the new American Republic. The king means to coerce us, but we will answer with Congress. We will answer with a unified front. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Abigail entered the cellar, her face drawn. The king's response has arrived in New York. It is worse than anticipated. 4 acts. The Boston Port Act shuts the harbor entirely. The Massachusetts Government Act abolishes the Assembly and hands all authority to the royal governor. The Administration of Justice Act allows British officials accused of crimes here to be tried in England, guaranteeing their acquittal. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And the Quartering Act. It demands that the city house the newly arriving troops. They are sending 4,000 reinforcements. General Gage will be the new governor. Elias listened, his body tensing with each revelation. Gage, the very general who commands the British forces. They are treating us as a captured city. It is not a government response, it is a military occupation, Josiah realized. Elias walked over to a stack of blank paper. The time for polite argument is over. This is not governance, this is tyranny. We are now a colony at war. Our purpose changes. He picked up a piece of charcoal and sketched out a new organizational chart on the stone wall of the cellar. 1. The unseen thread, intelligence and propaganda. Elias, Abigail, Josiah. our core. 2. The town committee, public front, Adams, Hancock, Warren. They will manage the public face of resistance and the relief efforts. 3. The Minutemen, the militias in the surrounding towns. We must arm them, train them, and connect them. Josiah, you are the most familiar with the surrounding towns, Lexington, Concord, Framingham. You must ride out not as a messenger for pamphlets, but as a liaison for arms and men. You must convince them that they are the true military force that will defend the assembly that the king just outlawed. But how do I convince them to risk war? Josiah asked, the enormity of the request suddenly overwhelming. Elias placed his hands on Josiah's shoulders, his grip firm. By reminding them of the oath you took here tonight. Not the oath to the king, but the oath to the principle. We swore to preserve the good of society and resist arbitrary power. That principle is now embodied in the militias. They are the last bastion of liberty. You must tell them, Josiah, that the first shot fired in Boston will be heard in Concord, and that their readiness will decide the fate of all 13 colonies. Josiah looked at Abigail. Her eyes were determined, without a hint of fear. She had already accepted the consequences. He reached into his pocket and touched the smooth, cold stone he still carried. I will do it, Josiah said. I will raise the Minutemen. The oath on midnight air was about to be tested by the reality of military confrontation. The unseen thread had become the nerve center of a revolution, and the apprentice printer was now its chief emissary. The silent, cold cellar of the print shop was the birthplace of a new military resistance.
The Boston Port Act went into effect on June 1st, 1774, though the town had been strangling since the king's orders first arrived in March. The harbor, usually a teeming forest of masts, fell silent. Warships anchored menacingly in the inner roads, their cannons trained on the wharves. The only vessels permitted to move were those carrying coal for the garrison and supplies for the troops. Boston, once the jewel of colonial commerce, became a giant, expensive military prison. General Thomas Gage, now the military governor, established his authority swiftly and brutally. He reinforced the only land access to the peninsula, the Boston Neck. The Neck was a narrow, low-lying strip of land connecting Boston to the mainland village of Roxbury, a vulnerable choke point barely 100 yards wide. Gage fortified it with a thick breastwork, 2 rows of cannon, and a permanent guardhouse, establishing a gallows of the Neck. Anyone passing was subject to inspection, questioning, and the threat of indefinite detention. For Josiah Reed, Elias Thorne, and Abigail, the closure changed everything. The unseen thread could no longer rely on simple couriers or public trade routes. Elias and Abigail were now sealed inside the cage, while Josiah, the arm of the cell, was charged with escaping it. "This is your final ride," Elias told Josiah in the cramped, damp cellar, the noise of British boots echoing faintly above them. "You carry 2 things, the hope of the Continental Congress and the immediate truth of Gage's intent." The immediate truth was concealed in a small, hollowed-out wooden button Josiah had sewn onto the lining of his coat. Inside was a tiny roll of paper, a coded diagram, and a list of locations. It was a map of the provincial powder and arms stores, and a warning that Gage's first military action would be to seize them. "This button is the difference between an organized defense and a desperate massacre," Elias stressed, his face drawn tight with urgency. "The militias will not fight without powder. You must get word to Captain Parker in Lexington and Colonel Barrett in Concord. They need to move the caches now." Abigail handed Josiah a loaf of heavy black bread and a waterskin. "You look like a baker's boy riding to deliver an overdue debt, not a spy carrying the keys to the continent. Act small, Josiah, act invisible." Josiah chose the darkest hour, well after midnight, on a night when a fierce, biting wind was whipping off the sea, promising rain that would turn the narrow neck road into a slick mess.
He approached the neck checkpoint on foot, leading his tired mare, Bess. The breastwork was manned by 2 soldiers huddled by a brazier, their muskets gleaming under the single lantern. "Halt! Who goes there?" The challenging voice was muffled by a heavy coat. "Josiah Reed, sir," he said, pulling his cloth cap low. "Printer's apprentice. My master, Elias Thorne, has a commission from Lieutenant Colonel Smith in Roxbury, a repair to his personal printing press. Late work, sir, but urgent." He presented a forged pass Elias had skillfully created, complete with a royal seal painstakingly carved from a potato, a piece of defiant absurdity. The soldier squinted at the pass, his breath clouding the air. Repairing a press at this hour? What sort of damnable urgency? "The colonel is writing a scathing article for the Massachusetts Gazette, sir," Josiah lied smoothly. "He requires new type to be set by morning, or he threatened to have my master whipped. My master sent me to fetch his tools before he suffers the lash." The soldier snorted, obviously familiar with the arbitrary cruelties of the officers. The wind howled, rattling the lantern. He didn't want to stand out in the cold arguing with a miserable apprentice. "Get on then, boy, and if that horse spooks and knocks over the general's brazier, I'll shoot you myself." Josiah led Bess forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a desperate drum. The ground beneath his feet was treacherous, slick with mud and half-frozen ice. Every slow step felt like a mile. He passed the 2 heavy 12-pound of cannons, their muzzles aimed inward at Boston. He moved past the breastwork, and the sudden feeling of openness on the Roxbury side was intoxicating. But the mission wasn't over. He had crossed the physical boundary, but the true frozen Rubicon was the psychological commitment from being a Boston protester to being a military operative in the field. Once past the immediate lights of the guard post, Josiah mounted Bess and began his ride west. The road was a grueling obstacle course. The winter landscape was relentless. Patches of glare ice, deep ruts of mud, and the omnipresent threat of British patrols, who frequently scouted the roads to secure provisions and intimidate the local populace. He traveled in the shadows, taking the back roads and farm paths he had mapped out months earlier. The sound of Bess's hooves was a terrifyingly loud percussion in the still night. After 6 hours of constant, exhausting riding, the first hint of dawn appeared, illuminating a bleak, snow-dusted landscape. He was approaching Lexington. Josiah found his contact, a farmer named Silas, near a dilapidated barn well outside the village center. Silas was a grizzled man of 40, part of the communication network Josiah had secretly established. "Josiah, you crossed the neck?" Silas demanded, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Gage has 4,000 new men. He has cannons on the neck and his hand on the throat of our government," Josiah gasped, sliding off Bess. "The port is closed, but Philadelphia answers with Congress. We must stand ready." Silas took Bess and gave Josiah a fresh horse, a sturdy plow mare named Prudence. "The news of Congress will hearten the men, but readiness is powder. The king's officers are making inquiries about the supply chain." Josiah reached into his coat and carefully prized open the wooden button, extracting the tiny scroll with trembling fingers. Gage plans a swift strike to seize it all. He knows the locations. We cannot afford a single barrel to fall into his hands, Josiah whispered, unrolling the diagram. Josiah, guided by Silas, rode into Lexington. It was a sleepy village centered around its common, but the men of the militia were already aware of the tension. They gathered in the basement of the tavern, their faces lit by the low flame of a fire pit. Josiah stood before them, a young man of 20, looking utterly spent but radiating purpose. Among them was Captain John Parker, a powerful man, slightly lame, but whose eyes held the flinty resolve of a natural leader. "Captain Parker, I bring the word of the unseen thread, acting on behalf of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. The king has abolished our charter. General Gage is an occupying power, not a civil administrator. We are now in a state of military resistance." Then he showed Parker the coded map and the list of locations. The militia's secret powder magazines, including one hidden beneath the floorboards of the Lexington Meeting House.
This is the heart of the matter, Captain, Josiah continued. Gage knows. His officers have compiled the intelligence. They will move on this powder within the month. If we lose the powder, we lose the means to resist. Captain Parker examined the list, his face grim. Beneath the meeting house, they'd profaned God's own sanctuary to disarm us. We can't let this leak. He looked around the room at the assembled men, farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen. Josiah, tell me about the Congress. Give these men the hope that will allow them to face the danger you carry. Josiah spoke of Richard Bosch, of the Pennsylvania Assembly, and the promise of unified colonial resistance. He described the unity that was forming not just as a protest, but as a commitment to establish a single continental government. The eyes of all the colonies are on us, gentlemen, Josiah concluded, sweeping his gaze across the faces. They are watching to see if Boston and the towns that stand with her will allow the king to take their arms and their liberty without a fight. The question is not if you will fight, but when you must be ready. Elias Thorne has called you Minutemen, ready to assemble at a minute's warning. The term stuck, Minutemen. It was a promise, a defiant declaration of readiness. Captain Parker stood up, his hand resting on the smooth stock of his musket. We move the powder tonight, every ounce. We will disperse it into the hands of loyal families in 3 different townships. You have given us warning, Josiah. Now we prepare the answer. Josiah needed to press on immediately to Concord, the main arsenal and storage point for the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. It was a longer, more challenging ride, and the day was growing late, increasing the risk of encountering British patrols. He reached Colonel James Barrett, the commander of the Concord militia, as dusk was falling. Barrett was a methodical, disciplined man, known for his stern dedication to the cause. Barrett absorbed the news quickly, studying the coded map of the powder caches, especially the locations of the heavy cannon and flour supplies vital to provisioning an army. Gage intends to not only take the arms, but the stores as well, Barrett observed, his voice low and dangerous. He will starve us out and disarm us in one fell swoop. Barrett issued immediate whispered orders. The Concord militia, better organized than Lexington's, began a massive, silent operation. Flour was hastily transported to private homes and buried in barrels. Cannons were disassembled and hidden in the dirt of farm fields, disguised by freshly plowed earth. Gunpowder was separated and concealed in haylofts and root cellars across a dozen square miles. Josiah spent a freezing, sleepless night observing the methodical removal of the provincial arsenal. This was not the chaotic passion of the Boston Tea Party. This was the cold, disciplined preparation for war. As dawn approached, Colonel Barrett gave Josiah a direct order. Your mission is complete here. Now you must ensure the chain is complete. Ride north to Worcester. Tell them that Gage knows of the caches, that the powder alarm is real, and that the Minutemen are organizing. Give them the same message. Conceal everything. Josiah, utterly exhausted, mounted Prudence. He had fulfilled his duty, but he was exposed, deep in the countryside, far from the safety of the city, and carrying information that could hang him. He pushed the horse hard on the road leading out of Concord. He had gone barely 2 miles when he heard the distinct, sharp rhythm of cantering horses behind him. Not a few, but a detachment. He spurred Prudence into the dark, wet woods. The horses, shoed for the road, struggled on the rough, uneven terrain. Josiah flattened himself against Prudence's neck, pushing through the thicket, the branches whipping at his face. The shouts of the soldiers grew closer. "Halt! In the name of the king!" Josiah glanced back and saw the flash of redcoats through the trees, a small patrol on a scouting mission alerted by the unusual activity around Concord. They were dangerously close. He burst out of the woods and onto a narrow lane that ran alongside a frozen creek. He urged Prudence into a full gallop,
praying the poor horse had something left. A musket cracked. The ball whizzed past his head, stinging the cold air, burying itself harmlessly in a tree ahead. He needed a distraction. He saw a small, dilapidated outhouse near an abandoned farm field. He swerved Prudence toward it, pulling the heavy black bread Abigail had given him from his saddlebag. He rode past the outhouse, throwing the dense loaf of bread into the roof timbers. The noise was dull, but distinct. A sharp thud, followed by the immediate sound of the crumbling wood. The soldiers, reacting instantly to the sound, pulled up, assuming he had dropped or thrown something valuable, or perhaps a bag of money. "Search that shed! He threw something!" the commander yelled. Josiah didn't look back. He galloped into the thicker underbrush on the far side of the creek, using the momentary confusion to gain a decisive lead. He heard the frustrated shouts of the soldiers, realizing their mistake, but by then he was gone, disappearing into the pre-dawn mist toward Worcester. The mission was successful. The Minutemen were warned, the powder was safe, and the first stones of the Continental Army were in motion. Josiah, the printer's apprentice, had crossed his frozen Rubicon, and the colonies, now unified in purpose and secretly armed, were ready to answer the king's coercion with revolution.
The winter of 1777 descended upon the Continental Army not as a gentle snow, but as a grinding, malevolent force. They had marched from the disastrous failure at Germantown, and the freezing, exhausted column of men, perhaps 12,000 strong, settled along the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania, a place of high ground and bitter wind known only as Valley Forge. The name itself felt like a promise of suffering. Sergeant Elias Eli Vance of the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment squinted at the bare, skeletal woods surrounding the camp. The landscape was beautiful in a terrifying, desolate way. Rolling hills of frosted brown grass and trees stripped bare, standing like skeletal sentinels against a sky the color of old pewter. "This ain't no winter quarter, Sarge," mumbled Thomas, a young farmer whose cheeks were raw and blue with cold. "It's a graveyard and waitin'." Eli didn't argue. He knew that even the best fortifications couldn't keep out the cold that was now in their bones, or the hunger that had become a permanent, gnawing resident in their stomachs. Yet the high ground offered a critical strategic defense against Sir William Howe's well-fed British forces 20 miles away in Philadelphia. General Washington had chosen this crucible, and they were the steel to be forged in it. The very first tyranny of the winter was the demand for shelter. They arrived in mid-December, and the men, many of whom were barefoot and dressed in rags, were ordered to become architects and lumberjacks. Log huts, 14 feet by 16 feet, were to be built without delay. Eli organized his squad, 20 men strong, but capable of producing only the strength of 15 due to dysentery and exhaustion. They fell upon the surrounding woods, their axes ringing hollowly in the frozen air. They were a ragged spectacle, men wrapped in tattered blankets or fragments of sailcloth, their feet bound with strips of raw cowhide, leaving bloody tracks in the snow. "We build it fast, lads," Eli commanded, hauling a massive log with the help of 2 others. "We build it tight. Every seam left open is a quart of blood lost to the frost." For days they worked on nothing but the construction of their barracks. The logs were hewn, the chinks stuffed with clay and mud, and the roofs clumsily thatched. Sleep was a restless, shivering thing, taken around meager fires that devoured precious wood. Eli's own hut, christened the Coffin by a soldier named Mac, was finished on Christmas Eve, a cramped, smoky haven that barely fit 12 men, but felt like a mansion compared to the canvas tents they had abandoned. But the hut provided only a partial victory. They had crossed the river and built a camp, but the war for survival was just beginning. The true crisis began in January. The Continental Army was a miracle of commitment, but a nightmare of logistics. The commissary department was a wreck of incompetence and corruption.
while barrels of salt pork and warm wool uniforms sat rotting in depots 100 miles away, accessible only by broken, snow-choked roads. The army was starving and freezing. The soldiers were, as Washington reported to Congress, literally without clothes. This was the famous nakedness of the army, a term that didn't just mean being threadbare, but utterly destitute. Eli had traded his worn-out boots weeks ago for a few handfuls of dried peas, and now his feet were wrapped in canvas scraps, swollen and painful. He had seen too many cases of frostbite already. They called the deep black frostbite frozen rot, and it often led to amputation. One morning, Eli found Mac, who had christened our hut, shivering uncontrollably. Mac was sitting by the dying fire, staring at his hands. "Mac, you all right?" Mac slowly unwrapped the rags from his feet. The toes were an impossible waxy blue, turning black at the edges. "I can't feel them, Sarge. Can't feel a thing. They're just stones strapped to my ankles." Eli's stomach clenched. He knew the drill. He got the surgeon, a beleaguered man named Dr. Miles, who looked older than Washington himself. Dr. Miles didn't even need to touch the feet. "The gangrene is setting in, Vance. Bring him to the hospital hut." The hospital hut was the worst place in Valley Forge. It was not a place of healing, but a miserable holding pen for the dying. The air was thick with the stench of sickness, unwashed bodies, and the lingering metallic smell of blood from crude surgery. They dragged Mac there, and Eli left him with a promise he knew he might not keep. "I'll find you an extra blanket, Mac. Just hold fast." Mac died 3 days later, not from the amputation, but from the fever that always followed, the typhus that raged through the close quarters, or the dysentery that stripped a man of his last strength. The ground was too hard to dig proper graves, so the dead were stacked until a thaw allowed burial. The daily ration, when it came at all, was a cruel joke. It was often a handful of flour mixed with water, baked into a hard, tasteless patty they dubbed fire cake. "Fire cake and water, Sarge," Thomas muttered, chewing slowly. "That's what we fight for. That and the smell of our own stink." As the winter deepened into the paralyzing cold of February, the tyranny of the quarters became psychological. The commitment that had brought these men from their farms and shops began to fray. They had faced a professional army and held their own, but they were being defeated not by a red coat's bayonet, but by the indifference of their own government. The desertion rate soared. Every morning, the roll call was a fresh reminder of the men who had simply melted away in the night, choosing the disgrace of abandoning the cause over the certainty of death by starvation or disease. Eli hated them, and yet he understood. He hadn't deserted because of a promise he made to Washington, not the man, but the ideal he represented. One icy afternoon, a captain of the Light Dragoons rode into the camp, a handsome, well-fed figure in a rich blue coat carrying a dispatch. He delivered his news with the tone of official disgust. "Gentlemen, 2 deserters from the 7th have been apprehended. They are to be whipped at the main square at evening parade. The general insists that the punishment be exemplary." The whipping was a necessary horror. The raw screams of the men, the sickening thwack of the lash against frozen skin, and the silence of the assembled troops were a collective scream of pain. It was a reminder that freedom was purchased not just in blood, but in agony and compliance. The next day, Eli walked the perimeter of his section. He found a young private named Jenkins huddled outside his hut, crying, his body shaking, not just from the cold, but from despair. "I can't, Sarge," Jenkins sobbed, clutching his bare arms. "I can't find no food. I saw a rat last night, and I wanted to kill it and eat it raw. I ain't no soldier. I'm an animal. I want to go home." Eli sat beside him, ignoring the biting wind. He pulled a small, rough piece of dried jerky, a piece he had been saving for 3 days, from his coat pocket. "Take this, Jenkins," Eli said, handing it over. Jenkins looked at the meat, then at Eli's gaunt face. "But that's your. It's a command, Private. Eat it. Now listen to me. You want to go home? Fine. But what are you going home to? The redcoats are in Philadelphia, drinking our wine and sleeping in our beds. They'll be on your farm next telling you what you can plant, what you can say, and who you can pray to." Eli leaned closer, his voice fierce but low. "We aren't fighting for rations, Jenkins. We are fighting so that when we walk out of this hell in the spring, we walk out as free men, not as subjects who begged for mercy. We are the last chance. If we quit, the whole thing falls down. We have to be better than the cold, better than the hunger, better than the disease. We have to be tougher than this winter."
Jenkins swallowed the jerky, tears running paths through the grime on his cheeks. He stood up, wiping his nose with the back of a raw hand. "Yes, Sarge, I understand." That night, Jenkins did not desert. The reason Eli and so many others stayed was visible almost daily. General George Washington. He was the rock in the swirling sea of despair. While Congress debated and quartermasters lined their pockets, Washington endured the same conditions as his men. His headquarters, the Isaac Potts House, was only a relative comfort, cold, drafty, and constantly filled with the clamor of desperate officers. Eli often saw the general riding through the camp, an imposing, lonely figure on horseback, wrapped in his dark greatcoat. He never failed to stop, to look at the men, and to offer a word of strained encouragement. His presence was not just leadership, it was sacrifice embodied. A critical turn in the supply crisis came in late February, when General Nathaniel Greene, Washington's trusted officer, was put in charge of the commissary. Greene, a man of ruthless efficiency, scoured the surrounding countryside, compelling farmers, often against their wishes and for rapidly depreciating continental currency, to release their stored goods. Eli witnessed the arrival of the first significant supply train in weeks, wagons piled high with barrels of salt fish, sacks of dried beans, and miraculously, bundles of fresh, uninfected shoes and blankets. The effect was electric. It was a physical sign that they were not forgotten, that the cause still had power, and that their suffering had not been in vain. The men devoured the food and wrapped themselves in the rough wool blankets, laughing, weeping, and shouting their gratitude. "A blanket," Thomas cried, rubbing the coarse wool against his cheek. "I forgot what a blanket felt like, Sarge. I can feel my toes again." Eli allowed himself a small smile. They would not starve today. They would not freeze today. The final defining act of the winter quarters came in March 1758, with the arrival of a foreign element that would change the very nature of the Continental Army, Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Von Steuben was a Prussian military officer, a man of rigid discipline and legendary temper, who arrived at Valley Forge with grand claims of having been an aide to Frederick the Great. While his claims were exaggerated, his skill was not. He looked at the American soldiers, the raw, undisciplined, yet fiercely independent farmers and mechanics, and saw the material for a true army. Von Steuben immediately set about drilling the men. He didn't speak a word of English, but he bellowed his commands in French and German, relying on translators and furious gesticulation. Eli was initially skeptical. After months of surviving against nature, was a parade ground drill the answer? But the Baron's approach was revolutionary. Instead of teaching officers, he took a squad of 100 men, including Eli's own, and drilled them personally. He taught them the Prussian manual of arms, the precision of the march, and the deadly efficiency of the bayonet charge. "Attention!" the Baron would roar, his face turning a furious crimson when the men stumbled over the drill. "Sacre bleu! You call that shoulder a musket? You are sheep! Sheep, I say! You must stand straight! You must fight like lions!" He would swear, throw his hat on the ground, and foam at the mouth, then immediately apologize in a rush of broken English, endearing himself to the men with his theatrical rage and his fundamental respect for their effort. Eli, watching the transformation, realized the depth of the Baron's genius. He was not just teaching them to load a musket, he was teaching them identity. He was replacing the independent, often chaotic spirit of the militia with the unified, responsive body of a professional line. The men who had survived the nakedness, the starvation, and the sickness of the winter now found purpose in the precision of the drill.
Their suffering was no longer a useless hardship. It was the shared foundation of a new fighting force. By the end of April, the skeleton army that had staggered into Valley Forge had become the Continental Army. They were still poor, still hungry, but they stood in straight lines, executed maneuvers flawlessly, and understood the deadly rhythm of European warfare. The spring thaw finally came, washing away the mud, the last stubborn patches of snow, and the physical evidence of the winter's toll, but it could not wash away the scars on the men's hearts and bodies. Eli Vance stood on the parade ground, wearing a reasonably new uniform, his musket gleaming, and watched the entire army march in formation. The sight was staggering. Where there had been chaos, there was now order. Where there had been weakness, there was now unified strength. He thought of Thomas, of Mac, and of Private Jenkins. They had all, in their own way, been forged in the cruel fire of the valley. The tyranny of the winter quarters had been broken. It had killed thousands, but it had saved the cause. In June 1778, the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge. They were ragged veterans, battle-hardened not by bullets, but by cold and neglect. They had emerged from their huts, their suffering woven into the very fabric of their resolve. Their first test came at the Battle of Monmouth, weeks later, when Washington ordered his Continental troops to face the seasoned British regulars. They did not scatter. They stood shoulder to shoulder, firing disciplined volleys, executing the maneuvers taught by von Steuben, and fighting the enemy to a standstill. Eli, reloading his musket amidst the smoke and noise, knew then that the war had turned. The men who had survived the brutal winter had proved that they would endure any hardship for liberty. The sacrifice of Valley Forge had paid the price for the American future. They were no longer just a collection of rebels. They were an army of the United States, and they would not be defeated.
General Ethan Cole, known across the Army of the Potomac as Ironwood for his unyielding resolve and unforgiving strategic discipline, felt the cold, metallic taste of autumn mud on the wind. It was the last week of October 1862, and the air was crisp with the promise of a hard winter. Cole sat hunched in his campaign tent, the single flickering lamp casting long, restless shadows that mirrored the turmoil in his mind. His mission was simple, brutal, and non-negotiable: seize and destroy the Potomac and Western Junction. This junction, a spider web of rails nestled deep in the unforgiving terrain of northern Virginia, was the last viable supply link for the main Confederate corps currently maneuvering north. If Cole's cavalry division could secure and destroy the bridge and the accompanying depot before dawn, the rebel army would be functionally starved, forced to retreat southward or face total annihilation by the larger Union forces closing in. A strategic victory of this magnitude could shorten the war by a year, saving tens of thousands of lives. His orders, handwritten by General Halleck himself, were clear. General Cole, you have carte blanche. The junction must be rendered unusable. The cost is irrelevant to the overall objective. Cost irrelevant, a phrase that always grated on Cole's soul, yet defined the brutal calculus of his profession. He looked at the tactical map pinned to the rough table, running a scarred finger over the red penciled lines of the enemy's deployment. The junction was defended by a small but well-placed brigade holding a crucial defensive line. A thick, rocky bluff overlooking the trestle bridge, fortified with 2 aging siege guns. "The reconnaissance is firm, General," reported Major Alistair Vance, Cole's loyal chief of staff. Vance was a young, sharp officer completely devoid of sentiment. "The primary force is the 4th Virginia Infantry. They're dug in on Bluff Hill, guarding the trestle. We estimate about 800 men. They won't yield." "They don't need to yield, Major," Cole replied, his voice a low, steady rumble like stones shifting deep underground. "They need to be annihilated. Our artillery will open from the South Ridge at 0400 hours, followed by the mounted charge. We must shatter the defensive line before first light and burn that bridge to ash.
Understood, General. I'll send the final coordinates to Battery C, Vance said, turning to leave. Wait, Major. Cole held up a hand. He picked up a discarded scrap of paper, a hastily drawn sketch made by one of the scout sergeants who had infiltrated the Confederate position earlier that evening. It depicted the small headquarters nestled behind the siege guns on Bluff Hill. The enemy commander. Do we have confirmation of his identity? Cole asked, his gaze fixed not on the name, but on the precise location of the small command post, which was marked as being directly in the planned line of fire for the Union batteries. Vance frowned, checking a sheaf of intelligence reports. Yes, sir. It's been confirmed by 2 captured prisoners this evening. The brigade is commanded by Colonel Jasper Thorne. Young fellow, very aggressive, and reportedly quite effective at defensive deployment. General Cole's hand tightened around the edge of the map, his knuckles whitening against the dull lamplight. He felt the cold iron of the strategic necessity suddenly crack, revealing a burning human core beneath. Colonel Jasper Thorne. The name hit Cole with the force of a cavalry charge. It wasn't the name itself, it was the truth it contained. Jasper Thorne was his son. Cole had not seen him in 3 years. 3 years since Jasper had walked out of their Washington home, leaving behind his commission from West Point and a letter filled with cold, articulate rage. The political chasm that had split the nation had first opened inside their family. Jasper, a brilliant idealist, had been a fervent abolitionist, believing the Union must fight, but only if it made the immediate, explicit commitment to free all slaves. When Lincoln and the War Department initially prioritized preserving the Union over abolition, Jasper saw it as a moral failure, a betrayal of the Republic's founding principles. In a horrific twist of ideology, Jasper concluded that the Confederacy, with its clear, if despicable, defense of state sovereignty, was at least fighting for a principle, while the Union was fighting for a corrupt political compromise. He had vanished, reappearing months later in Confederate gray, commissioned as an officer and rising quickly through the ranks under a new, borrowed surname, Thorne, a deliberate rejection of the Cole lineage. Ethan Cole had carried the weight of that betrayal like a lead ball in his chest. He had buried his grief in military rigor, doubling down on his duty, determined that his actions would justify the very cause his son had abandoned. Now that lead ball had become a cannonball, poised to launch directly at his own child. Vance watched his general, puzzled by the sudden, intense stillness. "Sir, is there a problem with Colonel Thorne?" Cole forced himself to breathe, his jaw aching. "No, Major, no problem. Simply, a name I recall from West Point. A talented young man. But proceed with caution. He'll know how to position his guns." "Indeed, sir, but our objective is the rails, not the men. The barrage is designed to suppress the guns and destroy the trestle in one coordinated action. Thorne's command post, however, is directly behind the forward battery. He will be neutralized, one way or another." "He will be neutralized," Vance spoke, the military jargon easily, abstracting death into a tactical term. Cole, the father, heard only one word: killed. The planned artillery bombardment was the strategic key. The ridge offered a perfect line of sight and an overwhelming advantage. To delay or alter the barrage meant losing the element of surprise. The Confederate Corps was expected to begin their retreat maneuver sometime after 0600 hours. Cole had a 2-hour window to break the defense and smash the rails. Every minute of delay jeopardized the entire campaign. He stared at the map again. His son was 2 miles away, behind the enemy's lines, waiting for the dawn that would either bring his execution or his escape. General Cole dismissed Vance, promising the final order at 0330 hours. Alone in the tent, the silence was broken only by the scratching of his pen as he pretended to review the supply lists. He poured himself a glass of lukewarm water and drank it, trying to wash away the sudden dryness in his throat.
The duel was now being fought entirely within his breast. The general whispered, "Orders are absolute. The war is not a family squabble. This is not about sentiment. This is about ending the bloody business. One son's life versus the thousands who will fall if this war drags on another year. Your duty is to the flag, to the Union, and to your president. You are ironwood. You break before you bend." The father pleaded. "He is your blood. He is brilliant, misguided, but yours. You failed to reach him when he was alive. Do not succeed in killing him when he is entrenched. Delay the bombardment. Send a courier. Offer him a chance to retreat, to surrender. He took the name Thorn for pride. You can save him using the name Cole." If he delayed the barrage even by 30 minutes, he risked everything. Colonel Thorn, aggressive and intelligent, would surely realize his position was scouted and shift the heavy guns, negating the Union's advantage. If the main Confederate corps arrived and found the junction intact, they would escape the net. Cole would be accused of insubordination, court-martialed, and dismissed in disgrace. The cost would be catastrophic. The strategic advantage lost, the campaign failed, and the war prolonged. He would be known forever not as Ironwood, but as the general who valued his own blood over the nation's future. But how could he, a man who had sworn an oath to preserve life and liberty, willingly order the death of his own child, regardless of the uniform he wore? Cole pulled a small, leather-bound Bible from his trunk, the only personal item he carried from home. It fell open to a page marked by a lock of dark, curly hair. It was Jasper's hair, snipped on his 10th birthday. He remembered the arguments, the passionate intensity in Jasper's eyes, the conviction that the means of war must justify the ends. "Father, you fight for a compromised Union that still holds men in chains. I fight for true principle." "Principle without victory is pointless, son," Cole had roared back, the final, unforgivable words that had driven Jasper away. Now victory was within his grasp, but it demanded the ultimate personal sacrifice. He took a deep, ragged breath and put the Bible away. He felt the vast weight of the army resting on his shoulders, the lives of his own men, the future of the Republic.
This is the true duel for a general's heart, he realized. It is not between duty and love, it is between weakness and strength. Strength in war is the ability to choose the necessary atrocity over the comforting lie. At 0300 hours, a nervous young courier stumbled into the tent. "General Cole, sir, I was ordered by Major Vance to deliver this immediately." The courier handed Cole a crumpled, blood-stained piece of cloth. It was a fragment of a Confederate battle standard, wrapped around a thick, crude sheet of paper. Cole unfolded the paper. It was a note scribbled in a tight, precise hand he recognized instantly. "Father, your scout was intercepted. We know the composition of your force and the probable hour of your attack. I have men. I have 2 12-pounders. We have fortified the bluff beyond belief. The junction will hold. Your duty calls you to attack. My duty calls me to hold. I will not fail the Confederacy. But I beg you, do not waste your men's lives on a frontal assault. Withdraw. ... JT. The intelligence was a trap. Jasper had captured the scout, recognized the insignia of his father's division, and used the opportunity not just to warn, but to challenge and manipulate. He was using their history, their relationship, as a weapon against the Union. The letter changed everything. Jasper wasn't a passive target. He was an active, knowing participant in the duel, daring his father to choose strategy over sentiment. He was calling his father's bluff, betting that General Cole would not have the moral fortitude to order the direct, lethal strike against his own son. The clock in the tent ticked toward 0330 hours.
Cole felt a chilling sense of clarity amidst the chaos of his emotions. His son had made his choice years ago. He had chosen an ideology over his family, and now he was using that choice to threaten the lives of thousands of Union soldiers and jeopardize the entire war effort. If he responded to the note, if he delayed or changed the plan, he was giving aid and comfort to the enemy, an enemy commanded by his own son. He would be confirming Jasper's belief that sentiment, not principle, ruled the general's heart. General Cole straightened, the stiffness returning to his spine, the father receding behind the iron discipline of the commander. The duel was over. Duty had won, but the victory felt like a final, fatal wound. He strode out of the tent, the cold air immediately sharpening his focus. Major Vance was waiting with the battery commander, a nervous captain named Hayes. "General, the time is 0335 hours. Do we commence the barrage at 400? Vance asked, his voice clipped. Cole looked toward the darkness where Bluff Hill lay, imagining the young colonel sitting in his command post, confident in the power of his psychological gambit. "No," Cole said, his voice flat and absolute. Vance and Hayes exchanged glances, shock momentarily breaking Vance's composure. "Sir, but the surprise element—" "I said no, Major. We do not commence the barrage at 400. We will not give Colonel Thorne the expected frontal engagement he has prepared for." Cole pointed at the map with a gloved hand, indicating a dense, heavily wooded gorge several hundred yards to the east of the junction. "Hayes, you will open fire with Battery C at 400 precisely. Do not target the bluff. Target the approach road that runs through the eastern gorge. Shell it heavily for 20 minutes. Lay down a convincing, sustained feint." "But sir, that road is empty. We need to disable those guns," Captain Hayes protested. Cole's eyes were cold. "You will fire on the gorge, Captain. The objective is misdirection, not destruction. You will create the illusion of a main assault here." He turned to Major Vance. "Major, immediately detach the 5th Cavalry Regiment and the 21st Infantry. I want them moving now. They are to take the long, brutal trail through the marsh to the west, a 4-mile flanking maneuver. They will arrive at Bluff Hill around 5:30 hours. The men will be exhausted, but they will be behind Colonel Thorne's defensive line. The 5th Cavalry will dismount and use their carbines to eliminate the siege guns from the rear. The 21st will secure the bridge and the depot." Vance stared, instantly recognizing the audacious risk and the strategic genius. The maneuver was incredibly difficult, relying on hours of silent, agonizing marching through near impassable terrain, and sacrificing the initial decisive blow. But if it worked, it would circumvent Jasper's prepared defenses entirely, turning his strength into a fatal weakness. "Sir, the flanking march will require them to arrive at the peak of the Confederate retreat hour. They'll be exposed if Thorne realizes the deception early." "He won't," Cole said with grim certainty. "He's expecting a straight fight. He's betting on my heart to save his life. I'm betting on his arrogance to save the Union. Give the order, Major. The only way to win this duel is to refuse to fight it on his terms." Vance saluted, turning quickly to relay the complex orders. General Cole sat alone for the next 2 hours, listening to the muffled sounds of the army moving to execute the desperate flanking maneuver. At 400 hours, the southern ridge erupted. The heavy cough of the artillery barrage was deafening, the shells whistling through the darkness toward the empty eastern gorge. The barrage was a magnificent, violent lie. On Bluff Hill, Colonel Jasper Thorne was indeed watching the pyrotechnics. He smiled grimly, satisfied that his father, despite the note, had chosen the predictable if suicidal frontal assault. He ordered his men to hold their fire, waiting for the cavalry charge that would break against his entrenched position. But the charge never came. At 5:30 hours, as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, the 5th Cavalry, their uniforms soaked and caked in marsh mud, materialized silently at the apex of Bluff Hill, behind the Confederate siege guns. The sound that finally broke the dawn silence was not the roar of cannon, but the sharp, close-range cracks of carbines. The Confederate batteries were silenced within 3 minutes. The 21st Infantry surged down the hill, catching the 4th Virginia completely off guard. The defenders, now surrounded and leaderless, broke quickly. General Ethan Cole arrived at the junction at 0615 hours, just as the engineers were dousing the wooden trestle bridge with oil. The battle was over. The junction was his. He rode up Bluff Hill, now littered with the signs of a sharp, brief fight. He found Major Vance standing over a figure slumped near the overturned siege gun. "General, the objective is secure, the bridge is burning, the depot is scheduled for detonation at 0700 hours. We have taken 600 prisoners, sir." Cole dismounted and walked slowly toward the figure. "And Colonel Thorne?" Cole asked, the words catching in his throat. Major Vance removed his cap. "Sir, he was found here, shot in the chest, a clean, rapid action. Sir, he was still clutching this." Vance handed Cole the crude note, the one Jasper had sent hours earlier. Cole looked down at the pale, still face of his son. Jasper was wearing a gray coat, but his expression was that of the intense, principled young man who had walked out the door 3 years ago. He was clean, unscarred by the siege, eliminated swiftly by the maneuver his own mind had failed to predict. Cole felt no triumph, only a vast, crushing emptiness. He had won the strategic battle and fulfilled his duty to the nation, ensuring the campaign's success. He had refused to let his personal heart betray the general's judgment. "Send him back to Washington, Major," Cole ordered, his voice flat. "Send him to his mother." He turned and looked toward the burning bridge, a pillar of smoke rising into the cold, clear morning. The duel for the general's heart had been won with ice and steel, and the cost was the only thing he had ever truly loved. He was ironwood again, but the core of the wood was scorched black, and the victory was a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. "The war continues, Major," General Cole said, climbing back onto his horse, turning his face south toward the next inevitable battle. "Let's move."
Captain Silas Kincaid, commanding Company F of the 140th New York Volunteer Infantry, tasted the dust and the metallic tang of fear. It was the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, and the fields outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania simmered under a merciless summer sun. The air was thick and heavy, not just with humidity, but with the palpable tension of two massive armies preparing for a collision that felt less like strategy and more like fate. Silas and his regiment, part of General Sickles' 3rd Corps, had been hastily moved to occupy a curving, exposed line far ahead of the main Union position on Cemetery Ridge. Sickles, convinced he knew better than his superiors, had pushed his men out to the notorious Peach Orchard, leaving a dangerous convex salient exposed. Silas stood in the narrow, sunken road separating a dense wood, the edge of the infamous Devil's Den, from a field of ripe golden wheat. The wheat stood taller than a man's knee, swaying gently as if whispering secrets to the wind. It was a beautiful, peaceful scene, a deceptive canvas for the hell that was about to erupt. "Kincaid," rasped Colonel Patrick O'Malley, his commander, wiping sweat from his brow. "Keep your boys low. They're coming. I can feel it in the air. General Hood's Texans are massing in that wood line, and they are hungry." Silas peered across the wheat field. The silence was unnerving, a silence that precedes a great storm. He could hear the faint, muffled shouts of Confederate officers and the telltale rattle of equipment being readied.
His company was comprised of farmers, clerks, and dock workers from upstate New York. They were good men, exhausted and terrified, but held together by a fragile thread of shared loyalty and duty. Among them was Private Caleb Stone, a 16-year-old drummer boy who had lied about his age to follow his older brother into the service. Caleb now held a rifle, his face pale, his eyes wide with an awful certainty. "Captain," whispered Caleb, his voice trembling, "do you think we'll hold this?" Silas placed a reassuring, heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "We hold, Private, because if we don't, there's nothing between them and the rest of the army. We are the wall, Caleb. We stand here or the Union breaks." The Confederate assault began with a sound that felt like the world tearing apart. It was a massed artillery barrage that shook the ground, deafening the men and raining iron and splintered wood onto their exposed position. The 140th New York braced for the wave of infantry. They had been waiting for Longstreet's attack. The great flank assault meant to roll up the Union line from the south. The enemy, comprised of General John Bell Hood's seasoned division, poured out of the woods and into the wheat field. The sight was overwhelming. Thousands of men in dusty gray and brown, charging with the chilling, high-pitched rebel yell. "Fire!" Colonel O'Malley screamed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the battle. Silas's men opened fire, the air instantly filling with the acrid smell of black powder smoke. The wheat field, moments ago a symbol of peace, became a slaughterhouse. The long, dense grain became a shroud for the falling, their gray uniforms dissolving into the green and gold. The Confederates hit Silas's position like a battering ram. The fighting was not line against line, but hand-to-hand chaos. Silas fired his revolver until it was empty, then drew his saber, parrying a bayonet thrust from a massive bearded Texan. "They're flanking us on the left!" screamed Sergeant Miller, falling back with a wound to his arm. Silas saw the danger. The enemy was pivoting, driving toward the exposed flank of the 140th, threatening to crumble their entire line. Fall back to the road!" Silas yelled, rallying his men, pushing them back from the edge of the wheat field and into the sunken road. For the next half hour, the ground was contested foot by foot. The sunken road was a bloody trench, the bodies of the fallen Union and Confederate soldiers creating a grotesque breastwork. The sun beat down, turning the spilled blood to a glistening varnish on the dry earth. Silas watched Caleb Stone, the young drummer, fighting with a ferocity born of sheer panic. Caleb drove his bayonet into a Confederate soldier who had breached the line, then immediately turned and fired his rifle at another, his face a mask of terror and determination. He was no longer a boy. He was an engine of war. The intensity of the attack was too great. Sickles' position, always tenuous, began to collapse under the weight of the coordinated Confederate advance. The peach orchard was lost. The Devil's Den was overrun. The Confederate forces, tasting victory, now focused their fury on the next obstacle, the wheat field. The Union retreat was not a rout, but a fighting withdrawal. They fell back across the infamous field, leaving the protection of the sunken road. Now they were fully exposed. It was here, in the tall wheat, that the battle transformed into a vortex of sheer brutality, a place where units were swallowed whole and men fought not for territory, but for their next breath. The air was so choked with smoke that it was impossible to see more than 10 feet. Men were firing at shadows, relying on the sound of the rebel yell or the blue flash of a Union uniform. The 140th New York was reinforced by elements of the Pennsylvania reserves, and for a fleeting moment they counterattacked, pushing the Texans back across the bloody field. The battle line surged back and forth over the same ground half a dozen times. "We are losing the center, Captain," shouted Colonel O'Malley, holding his side where blood bloomed on his tunic. "We need reserves. If they get past here, they have clear access to Cemetery Ridge." The importance of the wheat field was now agonizingly clear. It was the linchpin. If the Confederates could secure it, they could pivot north, take the high ground of Little Rod Top, and break the entire Union left flank, making the entire position untenable. This battle would decide the war.
Silas looked around at the devastation.
The once golden field was now flattened, stained scarlet, and strewn with dead and wounded. The noise was maddening, the constant crackle of musketry, the screams of the injured, the frantic shouts of officers trying to assemble fragmented companies. His own company was reduced to perhaps 50 men. Caleb Stone stood next to him, his rifle barrel smoking, his jacket torn, but his eyes steady. "Caleb, keep your head down. Where's Sergeant Miller?" "Gone, sir. I saw him go down near the big rock," Caleb replied, reloading with grim mechanical efficiency. Just then, a fresh line of Confederates burst through the smoke, emerging from the woods on the wheat field's northern edge. They were Georgians, organized and relentless. "Fix bayonets," Silas roared, drawing his saber and pointing toward the enemy line. "Charge! For the Union!" It was a desperate, suicidal move. They charged into the smoke, screaming, slamming into the Confederate line. The impact was sickening, a crush of bodies and cold steel. Silas felt the hilt of his saber crack against a man's skull. He was fighting blindly, motivated only by the absolute necessity of delaying the enemy for a few more minutes. He was driven to his knees, struggling against two gray-clad soldiers, when a musket shot rang out and one of his attackers collapsed. Caleb Stone stood over him, his face covered in soot and blood, having fired the single, desperate shot. "Get up, Captain! We have to move!" Caleb screamed, pulling Silas up by his shoulder. They stumbled back, joining a rapidly disintegrating mass of Union soldiers. The wheat field was irrevocably lost. Hood's Texans and the Georgian brigades had conquered the ground, but they were exhausted, disorganized, and shattered by the fight. The Union Third Corps had paid the price, sacrificing itself to buy precious time. As Silas dragged a wounded man toward the relative safety of the rear, he looked back at the wheat field. The ground was no longer recognizable as a field of grain. It was a mud pit, churned by cannon fire, slick with rain that had started to fall, washing the grime from the sky and the blood from the ground into gruesome streams. They were treated toward the next line of defense, a low stone wall at the foot of Little Round Top, where reinforcements, elements of the V and 6th Corps, were finally arriving. The sacrifice of Sickles' Corps had not saved the ground, but it had bought the time required for General Meade to plug the fatal gap in his line. Silas collapsed behind the stone wall, the thunder of the main battle now shifting to the higher ground of Little Round Top, where Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade was fighting the desperate, iconic battle for the Key Hill. Colonel O'Malley, his face gray from pain and exhaustion, stumbled up to Silas. "We did it, Kincaid. God help us, we did it. We broke their momentum." "The wheat field is gone, Colonel," Silas said hoarsely. "Aye, but they are broken too. They fought until they were empty. They can't sustain the push. We bled them out in that grain, Silas. We delayed them long enough for the reserves to secure the high ground. Look!" O'Malley pointed toward Little Round Top. Through the smoke, Silas could make out the silhouette of Union artillery firing in rapid succession, tearing into the Confederate advance. They had arrived just in time. The entire Federal position was anchored. The terrible sacrifice of the wheat field, the loss of thousands of men, including 2/3 of the Third Corps, had served its vital strategic purpose. It was the place where the Confederate flank attack stalled, transforming a near disaster into a crucial delay that saved the Union line. The sun set on July 2nd, 1863, bathing the decimated wheat field in a somber, bloody twilight. The fighting died down to sporadic firing and the harrowing cries of the wounded left behind. Silas found Caleb Stone huddled next to him, shivering, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. "You saved my life, Private," Silas said, his voice raw. Caleb looked up, his eyes empty. "I killed a lot of men, Captain. I don't know why I'm not dead. You're alive because the Union needed you to stand. You're alive because we held the line long enough." The fighting on the third day, the next day,
would culminate in the massive, futile charge known as Pickett's Charge. But the true climactic moment, the moment that secured the Union victory at Gettysburg, was the defense and sacrifice of the 2nd and 3rd Corps on July 2nd. Silas Kincaid survived the Battle of Gettysburg, but he never forgot the wheat field. It was the place where the war changed, not with a grand strategy or a brilliant maneuver, but with the simple, terrible courage of men refusing to yield a piece of bloody ground. The Confederate Army, having failed to break the Union flank on the 2nd day, was defeated on the 3rd. General Lee was forced to retreat, his vision of invading the North permanently thwarted. When Silas returned home after the war, he often saw fields of ripe wheat swaying in the summer breeze. To the world, they were symbols of peace and harvest. To him, they were reminders of a 3-acre patch of ground in Pennsylvania, a place of ultimate sacrifice, where a generation of young men, both North and South, had poured their blood into the soil to decide the fate of the nation. It was the place where the Union was saved, forged in the terror and the glory of that terrible, decisive fight.
The ice-choked Delaware River was a cruel and unforgiving mirror to the despair that gripped the Continental Army. It was the night of Christmas, 1776. Lieutenant Elias Thorne, just 22 years old, felt the cold of the river not just on his exposed skin, but deep in his bones, a profound spiritual chill. Elias had enlisted with the fervor of a Massachusetts idealist, believing independence was a sacred, inevitable destiny. 6 months later, following crushing defeats in New York and the ragged, demoralizing retreat across New Jersey, he knew destiny was a luxury they could ill afford. They were a beaten, starving collection of ghosts, and their only hope lay in this desperate gamble, a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. "Keep your rifles dry, boys," Elias whispered to the 6 men of his platoon huddled in the flat-bottomed ferry. The sleet had turned to driving snow, and the wind howled like a banshee predicting death. "The general needs this. If we fail here, the cause is dead by spring." The men nodded grimly. They knew the stakes. Their enlistment contracts were due to expire on New Year's Eve. A victory was the only argument that could convince them, or the shattered nation, to fight on. The Hessians, professional soldiers hired by the British Crown, were the Continental's most chilling antagonists. They were disciplined, well-fed, and ruthlessly efficient. Their Jaegers, the light infantry and sharpshooters, were particularly feared. Among them, rumor elevated one man to near mythic status: Captain Caspar Richter. Richter was the commander of the forward Jaeger post guarding the western approaches to Trenton. He was known less for his rank and more for his preferred weapon, a long, curved, heavy-bladed hunting saber, used with terrifying precision. The Continentals called him simply the Hessian Blade. It was whispered that he preferred the quiet efficiency of the steel to the clumsy noise of musketry, and that he took no prisoners who had faced him in close combat. As the column, exhausted, delayed by the storm, and nearly frozen, finally began the 9-mile march toward Trenton, Elias tried to focus on his orders. His platoon was part of the vanguard assigned to neutralize the main Jaeger picket before they could raise the alarm. The march was agony. The roads were sheets of ice, and the fresh snow muffled their footsteps, offering stealth at the cost of stability. By 0700 hours, they were critically behind schedule. Dawn was breaking, threatening to steal the element of surprise. Elias and his men, moving ahead of the main column, reached the outskirts of Trenton, guided by the dim, snow-shrouded lights of the Hessian camp. The key objective was a small stone farmhouse known as the Jaeger House, which housed Richter's forward command. "Smith, take 3 men and flank around the barn," Elias ordered quietly, drawing his own pistol and the short utilitarian army saber he carried. "Jones, stay with me. If they see us, fire 1 volley, then bayonets."
They crept forward through a stand of skeletal winter trees. The Jägerhaus was silent, unnervingly so. The Hessians, celebrating Christmas the previous day, were almost certainly sleeping off their grog. As Elias cautiously rounded the corner of the house, he froze. The door to the Jägerhaus was splintered, hanging slightly ajar. Not by an incoming attack, but from a hasty exit. And standing sentinel in the middle of the yard, completely alone, was a figure that commanded the snow-swept silence. It was Richter, the Hessian blade. He was a tall, powerfully built man, dressed in a dark green Jaeger tunic, his face partially obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed cap. Unlike his sleeping compatriots, Richter was awake, alerted perhaps by a subconscious professional instinct or the distant rumble of the approaching main column. He didn't need to shout an alarm. He simply needed to hold the line for 30 seconds. In his hand, the fabled weapon glinted even in the weak morning light. The hunting saber, a magnificent, terrifying piece of steel, broader and heavier than a typical military sword. Richter spoke, his voice a low, cold cut through the noise of the wind. The language was German, but the meaning was clear. Amerikanischer Soldat, you are too late. He had been waiting, or perhaps only just woken. He had realized the peril and positioned himself as the necessary sacrifice to buy his commander, Colonel Rahl, crucial seconds of warning. Elias knew he could not allow a shot to be fired yet. The sound would shatter the surprise of the entire army. He had to neutralize Richter silently, instantly. "Smith," he hissed, "take 3 men and flank around the barn," drawing his own pistol and the short utilitarian army saber he carried. "Jones, stay with me. If they see us, fire 1 volley, then bayonets." They crept forward through a stand of skeletal winter trees. The Jägerhaus was silent, unnervingly so. The Hessians, celebrating Christmas the previous day, were almost certainly sleeping off their grog. As Elias cautiously rounded the corner of the house, he froze. The door to the Jägerhaus was splintered, hanging slightly ajar, not by an incoming attack, but from a hasty exit, and standing sentinel in the middle of the yard, completely alone, was a figure that commanded the snow-swept silence. It was Richter, the Hessian blade. He was a tall, powerfully built man, dressed in a dark green Jaeger tunic, his face partially obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed cap. Unlike his sleeping compatriots, Richter was awake, alerted perhaps by a subconscious professional instinct, or the distant rumble of the approaching main column. He didn't need to shout an alarm. He simply needed to hold the line for 30 seconds. In his hand, the fabled weapon glinted even in the weak morning light. The hunting saber, a magnificent, terrifying piece of steel, broader and heavier than a typical military sword. Richter spoke, his voice a low, cold cut through the noise of the wind. The language was German, but the meaning was clear. Amerikanischer Soldat, you are too late. He had been waiting, or perhaps only just woken. He had realized the peril and positioned himself as the necessary sacrifice to buy his commander, Colonel Rahl, crucial seconds of warning. Elias knew he could not allow a shot to be fired yet. The sound would shatter the surprise of the entire army. He had to neutralize Richter silently, instantly. "Smith," he hissed, "take 3 men and flank around the barn," drawing his own pistol and the short utilitarian army saber.
Richter lowered the tip of his saber, the point resting lightly on the frozen ground. He shifted his weight, waiting, his breathing even. He was enjoying the duel, toying with the inexperienced American officer. Elias knew the truth. This was not a fair fight between 2 officers. It was a demonstration, a brutal lesson in professional soldiery versus passionate amateurism. He was facing the very manifestation of the oppressive power they were fighting against. Well-trained, well-equipped, and utterly merciless. "Genug," Richter stated, a grim finality in the German word for enough. He prepared for the kill. The sheer exhaustion and fear that had plagued Elias for months suddenly coalesced into a sharp, singular focus. He wasn't fighting for independence, or for Congress, or even for Washington. He was fighting for the chance to breathe another breath, to keep the blood in his body. Richter surged forward, not in a fencing lunge, but a soldier's charge, raising the Hessian blade high for a decisive overhead cut. Elias abandoned his saber. He dropped his shoulder and sprinted forward, not toward Richter, but under the descending arc of the massive blade. The wind of the blow brushed his cap as he dove, hitting Richter low and hard, like a cannonball. The impact of the desperate tackle drove the air from Richter's lungs. The powerful Hessian stumbled back, the momentum of his failed strike throwing him off balance. The saber flew from his grip, spinning end over end before plunging its point into a frozen snowdrift 10 feet away. Both men hit the ground hard. Elias, fueled by adrenaline, was scrambling for a grip on his enemy. Richter, enraged by the indignity of the unconventional attack, roared and tried to throw Elias off. Richter was heavier, stronger, his hands calloused from years of professional violence. He gripped Elias's throat, slamming the young officer's head back against the frozen ground. Stars exploded in Elias's vision, and the grip on his windpipe was absolute. This is it. The end, Elias thought. His idealism dissolved into the immediate, terrifying reality of death. But Elias was closer to the raw, hard-won desperation of his men. He was fighting dirty, for survival, not for honor. He brought his knee up, ramming it into Richter's groin with every ounce of force he could muster. Richter gasped, the professional discipline breaking for a second. His grip loosened momentarily. Elias seized the chance. He shoved the Hessian back, rolled free, and scrabbled backward on his hands and knees. He saw the gleam of his army saber, dropped earlier near the stone steps. Richter recovered instantly, already rising, his face contorted in a mask of murderous fury. He knew the fight had become existential. He ignored the pain and charged Elias, intending to crush him with his bare hands. Elias reached the sword. He didn't rise. Kneeling in the snow, he raised the Continental saber in a reverse grip, not to fight, but to defend. Richter lunged, a terrible shout on his lips. Elias drove the Continental saber up and forward, bracing his arm against his knee. The blade, dull and utilitarian, found the seam beneath Richter's ribcage, burying itself deep. The roar stopped instantly. Richter looked down at the hilt protruding from his uniform, a look of profound, cold surprise washing over his face. He staggered, taking one clumsy step backward, then slowly pitched forward into the snow, lifeless. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the sound of Elias's own ragged, frantic breathing. He sat in the snow, his arm throbbing, his lungs burning, staring at the motionless body of the man known as the Hessian Blade. He had won, but the victory felt like a total erasure. The terror, the desperation, and the sheer physicality of the fight had stripped away every layer of his West Point education and the gentlemanly codes of warfare. He had prevailed not through skill, but through animalistic determination. "Captain, Elias!" It was Jones and the rest of the platoon, emerging from the trees, their faces pale as they saw the scene. The powerful Hessian Jaeger slain, the young American officer sitting in a pool of dark blood on the pristine white snow. Is he done?" Jones whispered. Elias pushed himself up,
retrieving his pistol and the Hessian's magnificent saber, which he tossed aside. The victory was his, but the weapon felt too heavy with the professionalism that had nearly killed him. "He's done, Jones," Elias rasped, his voice raw. He never raised the alarm. The way is clear. He looked toward the stone steps and saw a small group of Jaegers now stumbling out of the house, confused by the sudden commotion. They saw their captain dead, and before they could process the scene, the main body of Washington's army erupted into the town. The sound was no longer the whisper of the wind, but the furious crash of field artillery, the pounding of thousands of boots, and the triumphant, unified roar of the Continentals. The Battle of Trenton was on. Elias staggered into the town, his arm hanging uselessly, his uniform soaked in snow and the blood of his enemy. He was no longer the frightened idealist who crossed the river. He was a survivor who had stared down the face of overwhelming professional power and fought back with nothing but raw grit. The Hessian blade was defeated, not by a greater soldier, but by a desperate patriot. And that, Elias realized, as the sounds of celebration swelled around him, was the true foundation of American liberty. He walked on toward the sound of the drums, ready for the next fight.
Washington, D.C., November 27, 1941. The city was cloaked in the deceptive calm of late autumn, but inside the State Department building, the air was sulfurous. Robert Vance, a 35-year-old special assistant to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, stood by the window of his office, watching the leaves swirl down Massachusetts Avenue. He was waiting for the final hollow conference of the day, the diplomatic dance that had ceased to be a negotiation and become a charade. Vance was an expert on East Asia. His specialty was the intricate web of treaties intended to maintain global peace, chief among them the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922, which guaranteed China's sovereignty, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. Vance knew these documents were not merely broken, they were annihilated, shredded by the advancing Japanese tanks in Manchuria and the Yangtze River Valley. "They're here, Vance," said Mrs. Thompson, his secretary, her voice tight with disapproval. "Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kurusu." Vance smoothed his tie, a gesture of purely professional decorum. "Send them in." The Japanese envoys entered, two figures who embodied contradictory aspects of Japan's foreign policy. Admiral Nomura was genial, an old friend of President Roosevelt, genuinely seeking a path to peace, however narrow. Envoy Kurusu, sharp-eyed and inscrutable, felt like a wolf wearing a diplomat's clothes. The meeting lasted 90 excruciating minutes. Vance and Hull presented the final American proposal, the Hull Note, demanding Japanese withdrawal from China and adherence to the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922. The Japanese responded with polite, circular arguments, focusing on American prejudice and the unreasonable demands on their right to economic security in Asia. As the meeting concluded, Kurusu offered a smooth, disingenuous smile. "We shall study this, Mr. Vance. We remain committed to finding a peaceful solution. The spirit of our pacts endures." Vance shook their hands, his gaze meeting Kurusu's. There was nothing behind the envoy's eyes but contempt for the American faith in paper treaties. Vance knew the truth. The Japanese delegation was simply stalling. Their ultimate response would not come in a diplomatic pouch, but in fire and steel. The broken treaty was now a weapon of misdirection. Vance left the State Department and walked the 4 blocks toward the Executive Office Building, the unofficial hub of America's clandestine war preparations. He had been quietly recruited months ago by Colonel William J. Donovan, the man tasked with setting up the new intelligence service, soon to be the OSS. His secret assignment:
coordinate the non-official military and intelligence sharing with the few allies still standing against the Axis, primarily Great Britain and the exiled forces of Free France. Officially, the US was neutral. Unofficially, they were already at war. His destination was a small, windowless office near the map room, known internally as Station X. Inside Station X, the atmosphere was a controlled hurricane of activity. A large map of the Pacific dominated one wall, dotted with red lamps indicating the estimated positions of key Japanese naval units. Every red lamp felt like a ticking clock. Waiting for him was Sir Alistair Reed, a sharp, weary intelligence officer from the British Foreign Office who had been instrumental in the Lend-Lease transfer of destroyers for bases. "They bought themselves another 2 days, did they, Robert?" Sir Alistair asked, not needing the answer. "Caruso promised a counter-proposal by the 1st of December, Vance replied, pouring 2 cups of stale coffee. "We both know what the counter-proposal will be." "Indeed, the torpedo. The problem, my dear fellow, is that Whitehall requires more than your government's unofficial support. If Tokyo strikes, we need ironclad guarantees that the U.S. Navy will not simply defend its coast, but will join the global war immediately." Sir Alistair's anxiety was palpable. Britain was fighting for its life alone against Germany, and its colonies in Asia were gravely exposed to the imminent Japanese attack. If the U.S. retaliated only in the Pacific and ignored the European front, the balance of power would still swing disastrously toward the Axis. Vance sighed, running his hair through his hair. "The President is committed, Alistair, but Congress is bound by the Neutrality Acts. General Marshall and Admiral King need a casus belli that is unambiguous, a direct, unprovoked assault on American territory." "Then we wait for the blood to be spilled," Sir Alistair said bitterly. "But while we wait, we must formalize the alliance that Congress has refused to sanction." The tension broke the following morning with a single typewritten sheet of paper delivered by a military courier. It was a partial transcript from Operation Magic, the secret decryption of Japanese diplomatic and military codes. The transcript was the final instruction from Tokyo to its ambassadors in Washington. It was labeled the Wind Setting Code and contained the phrase "East Wind Rain," signifying a total rupture of relations with the U.S. and a final military action. The message ordered the embassies to destroy all code machines and essential documents by the end of the day. Vance read the transcript, and his stomach turned over. The envoys knew this was coming even as they smiled and spoke of peace. The broken treaty was confirmed to be a diplomatic shield for a military sword. He immediately took the transcript to Secretary Hull, the elderly secretary who had endured months of fruitless negotiation turned ashen. "They will pay for this treachery," Hull whispered, his voice shaking, not from fear, but from towering moral outrage. Then he composed a message for the president. "The Japanese are planning to strike in the immediate future." But the where and when remained elusive. The military consensus pointed toward the Philippines or Malaya. No one could fathom an attack on the remote naval base in Hawaii. That afternoon, Vance received a signal from Station X. Midnight, the basement crypt. The basement crypt of the executive office building was a small, dusty room reserved for highly sensitive interagency meetings. It was midnight, November 30th. Vance was joined by Sir Alistair and a new figure, Colonel Jean-Luc Dubois, representing the Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle. Dubois was a man of quiet intensity, his uniform immaculate despite the fact that his nation was currently occupied.
"Gentlemen," Vance began, the only light coming from a single desk lamp shining on a map of the globe. "The pretense is over. We know the attack is imminent. The question is not if the U.S. will enter the war, but how quickly and completely the U.S. will commit to your war against the Axis in Europe." Sir Alistair leaned forward. "The British Empire will hold the line in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. But if we are hit simultaneously in Asia, the logistics will collapse. We need immediate, full U.S. integration into the global supply chain, starting the moment the first shots are fired on U.S. soil. Specifically, we need a commitment to accelerate the delivery of 10,000 aircraft and immediate U.S. Navy patrols in the Western Atlantic, freeing our destroyers to fight in the Pacific. Colonel Dubois spoke, his French accent thick with urgency. The Free French have intelligence networks throughout occupied Europe, ready to act as a spearhead for the invasion that must eventually come. But we need American recognition, not just of our movement, but of our value. We need the guarantee that when America enters, it enters as an equal global partner, not as a Pacific avenger. Vance pulled out 3 copies of a document. It wasn't a formal treaty, merely an executive agreement, signed by key department heads and pre-authorized by President Roosevelt. It was a binding, clandestine pact that effectively created a combined command structure with Britain and a firm commitment to the Germany First strategy. This document, Vance said, placing his finger on the paper, guarantees the immediate deployment of the 8th Air Force to England, the immediate integration of U.S. intelligence with MI6, and the acceleration of Lend-Lease to critical levels starting the day Congress declares war. He offered a pen to Sir Alister. This is the new alliance, sir. A pact forged not in peace, but in the certainty of war. Sir Alister signed, his hand steady. God save the King, and God speed the Americans. Colonel Dubois signed next, his expression one of profound relief and steel. Vive la France! Vance signed last, affixing the date November 30th, 1941. The breaking of the old idealistic treaties had forced this new, pragmatic, and ruthless alliance into existence. The balance of power had swung in that moment, in that dusty basement, months before the official declaration. The fate of the war was sealed in that midnight handshake. The next few days were agonizing. The red lamps on the map room wall multiplied and moved with unnerving speed toward the American Pacific Fleet. On the evening of December 6th, the final decrypts arrived, indicating a decisive military action set for the next morning. Vance was at home, trying to sleep, when the phone rang at 1:45 p.m. Washington time, December 7th. Mr. Vance, Pearl Harbor is under attack. The voice on the other end was clipped, military, and utterly stunned. The news rippled through Washington like a shockwave. Disbelief turned instantly to unifying rage. Vance rushed back to the State Department. The mood was electric, fueled by fury and resolve. The diplomatic front was over. The military front had begun. The next morning, December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, his voice ringing with sober power. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Vance stood in the gallery, watching the faces of the congressmen. The isolationists, the pacifists, and the skeptics were gone. They were replaced by men and women united by the betrayal of a broken treaty and the demand for war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Before the dust had settled, Sir Alister and Colonel Dubois were back in Station X, this time not as secret agents, but as official, recognized allies. The document, Robert. Your midnight handshake. It's effective immediately. Vance placed the signed executive agreement in the center of the table. Effective immediately, I confirmed. The 10,000 aircraft will begin their transfer. The U.S. Navy is preparing Atlantic patrols, and General Eisenhower is already planning the European operation. The attack on Pearl Harbor had done what months of diplomacy could not. It had smashed the illusion of neutrality and allowed the new strategic alliance to instantly come alive. The Axis powers, expecting a protracted American mobilization, were about to face a unified global command, already planned and ratified in secret. Vance looked at the global map.
The red lamps that once signified enemy positions now seemed to light up the lines of communication connecting Washington, London, and the scattered forces of Free France. The balance of power had swung with the greatest force possible, not because America had declared war, but because a select few had recognized the broken treaty for what it was and had already built the foundational alliance for the conflict that was to come. The era of idealistic pacts was over. The hour of the Grand Alliance had begun.